Good evening and welcome. I'm Donald Kennedy, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen J. Gould, the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology at Harvard University, who will deliver the first of two of the 13th Annual Tanner Lecture in Human Values this evening. The purpose of the Tanner Lectures is to advance and to reflect upon the scholarly and scientific learning that relates to human values and valuation. That purpose embraces the entire range of values pertinent to the human condition, interest, behavior, and aspiration. The lectures are collected and published by the Tanner Foundation in an annual volume. Now, the Tanner Lectures are made possible here and elsewhere by a handsome gift from the Tanner Foundation, which is to say, from a remarkable man named Obert Tanner. Obert is a philanthropist and a moral philosopher, and in case that seems to some of you like an oxymoron, I will explain. Obert Tanner worked his way through undergraduate years at the University of Utah by selling, and then when he decided the product he had to sell was inadequately good, he started making it. The product was what is called, I believe, in the trade, recognition jewelry. He sold it to fraternities and sororities and to organizations that wished to honor the service of retiring employees. And during his undergraduate years at the University of Utah and his doctoral studies at Stanford, where, following the completion of his PhD in philosophy, he served as lecturer and as the acting dean of Memorial Church, he somehow kept that business alive by inculcating his values in associates he had left behind in Salt Lake City, so that when he returned to the faculty at the University of Utah as professor of philosophy, the business grew as he lectured. It ultimately made it possible for him to culminate a career of teaching and studying about values to a philanthropic career devoted to two philanthropic interests: beauty and truth. The first he exercises by building fountains on campuses he likes and in other public spaces. The second he exercises through the Tanner Lectures. Those of you who entered this building in the usual way may have noticed that 2 years of drought have at least transiently silenced beauty, but truth speaks on. That brings me to our speaker this evening. Professor Stephen J. Gould obtained his undergraduate degree from Antioch College, his PhD from Columbia University. He is the holder of more honorary degrees and awards than I care to mention or you need to hear. He is, among many other things, a MacArthur Prize Fellow, the recipient of a Distinguished Service Award of the American Humanists Association, named Scientist of the Year by Discover magazine. That merely serves to set out the range of his honors, but by no means plumbs their extent. He is the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology at Harvard University, the author of, among other titles, The Panda's Thumb, The Flamingo's Smile, Ontogeny and Phylogeny, and The Mismeasure of Man. He is known to many, and I suspect many of you, through his remarkable essays in natural history and in other places. He is one of my most thoughtful colleagues in the field of biology around the world, and so it is a special personal pleasure for me to introduce him tonight to deliver the first of the Tanner Lectures, Unpredictability in the History of Life. Professor Gould.
Primates are pattern-seeking creatures, and so, since we face a universe with a great deal of randomness in it, we really have to impose that psychic dimension upon a world that doesn't always agree with it. After all, we think we see constellations in the sky because the stars are disposed at random in the heavens. It would really take quite an effort to put stars in such a regular geometric order that one didn't see constellations. The clumping of true randomness will produce what we almost necessarily perceive as order as a result of this pattern of thought. But it's not just that. It's not that we only seek pattern, we also seek meaning. And at least for cultural reasons, we're virtually forced to seek meaning in a particular way. That is, in such a way that we can interpret the entire earth in our terms and see ourselves as the standard and measure by which all else can be assessed. When I talk about that subject, as I often do, I like to say that at least in my own field of biology, and at least with respect to interpretations of the history of life, there are many other biases that are probably more prominent for other considerations, that the primary biases based on our need to see pattern and meaning in our terms that we impose upon our studies of the history of life, I reduce to four. There are many others, and I think the four of them go together. This first, the attempt to depict the history of life as progressive. That's probably the most pervasive of all biases. All of these, of course, are designed, either consciously or not, to allow people to see the evolution of consciousness as the predictable end product of everything that came before. So this is the notion of progress, that the history of life can be seen as a sequence of predictable stages leading up to ourselves near the very end. The second of the great biases is determinism itself, that this progress is not capricious by any means, but is something that was predictable and arises from the nature of nature and natural law. Thirdly, it's the one I happen to have worked on most in my own career, gradualism, namely the steps to progress are not occasional odd and capricious leaps, but are in fact a fairly steady and continuous series of incremental advances. And finally, the bias that I like to call adaptationism, by which I do not mean narrowly Darwin's theory of selection at all, but the much broader meaning of the vernacular sense of that term, namely the notion that things fit, that fundamentally what exists on Earth ought to be. And you put those four together, it's basically one story, that the history of life is a determined, predictable, incremental sequence of fitting stages that eventually lead themselves up to the incarnation of human intelligence on this earth. Now, when I illustrate those biases, there are many sources, and to show that it's not a conceit of evolutionary theory or of mechanistic 19th century and later views, my favorite source is Pope's Essay on Man, which was written in the early 18th century, where you can see, and in heroic couplets to boot, so it has the virtue of both rhyme and brevity, you can see how those sets of biases go together in the pre-evolutionary world, so that it's a much deeper set of biases that, when Darwin changes the basic foundation for interpretation, carry right through into other systems. Let me just read you a few of the statements from the first epistle to the Essay on Man, which illustrate, and this is in a pre-evolutionary context, he's not talking about the ladder of evolutionary advance, but the old static chain of being. Far as creation's ample range extends, the scale of sensual and mental powers ascends. Mark how it mounts to man's imperial race from the green myriads and the peopled grass. We learned something about what rhymed in 18th century England, as well as a statement about the chain of being so interpreted. Now, just a little after that, he tells us how important it is that absolutely determined and predictable natural law regulate the universe, because were it not so, and were chaos, vernacular sense, to intervene, then indeed the whole universe would come apart, and he gives us his vision of a chaotic universe. Let earth unbalanced from her orbit fly, planets and suns run lawless through the sky. Let ruling angels from their spheres be hurled, being on being wrecked, and world on world. Heaven's whole foundations to their center nod, meaning node, and nature trembles to the throne of God. That's what it would be like. Now, on the question of adaptation and the fittedness of things, we have what are actually my favorite lines in the whole epistle, in which Pope tells us that many people are unsatisfied with the apparent poverty of the various human senses, but we really should be happy because the degree of sight and hearing that we have is exactly right. It's what we ought to have. And if we had more acute senses, we really wouldn't be happy about it, as he makes clear. He says, why, speaking first of sight, why has not man a microscopic eye? For this plain reason, man is not a fly. That requires a little exegesis. It was believed in the 18th century that the multifaceted eye of insects existed as it does in order to allow them to see as one would through a microscope, to see at their dimensions. Turns out to be false. He goes on, say what the use were finer optics given to inspect a mite and not comprehend the heaven. And then talking about the sense of touch, he says, or touch if tremblingly alive all o'er, to smart and agonize at every pore. And then my favorite couplet, which is about odor, he says, or quick effluvia darting through the brain, die of a rose in aromatic pain. Great vision. If nature thundered in his opening ears and stunned him with the music of the spheres, how would he wish that heaven had left him still, the whispering zephyr and the purling rill? And then there are the famous lines that you all know that close the first epistle, which I think illustrate the political context of hanging on to those biases as a general defense of a static world order. But all four of the biases come together. All nature is but art unknown to thee. All chance, direction which thou canst not see. All discord, harmony not understood. All partial evil, universal good. And spite of pride and erring reason's spite, one truth is clear: whatever is right. Now, I think in the sciences, these biases that we hold on to for dear life because they have some psychic necessity become, in a way, especially important because of the peculiar thrust that the history of science has had with respect to our concept of ourselves. Now, Freud said in a famous statement, which may be something of a caricature on the history of science, but I think is basically very insightful and correct, that the major thrust of the greatest of advances in the history of science has been step by step to thrust human beings one after the other off pedestals of previous degrees of cosmic arrogance and back into the abyss step by step, so that first we thought we inhabited a central body at the very center of a constrained universe, and then along came the first great revolution of Newton, Galileo, and Copernicus, and showed us that we were on some miserable little corner of, he says, of a world system of a magnitude scarcely conceivable. But we still had, he goes on, the good feeling that even if we were on some isolated hunk of rock for whatever reason, that at least God had chosen that hunk to incarnate in his own image this vision, until along came Darwin and taught us and relegated us, as Freud says, to descent from the animal world. And then in the least modest statement of intellectual history, as I like to say, Freud said, yeah, but after that we had to admit we were evolved, but at least we thought we had rational minds until I came along, and then But I've often thought, as I read this statement, which I think does make the biases more and more necessary, that Freud really left out one of the most important ones. I see Martin Rudwick here, who has written more elegantly about it than anyone, namely the discovery of time by geology. Surely that's a step Freud should have put in, because there's a special pedestal off which we tumbled when geology discovered that not only was the history of the Earth immense, that would have been fine if human history had been part of it for all that expanse, but that human history occupied some tiny little millimicrosecond at the very end, a sort of geological afterthought. Thomas Brown had said in his Religio Medici in the 17th century, he said, "Time we may comprehend, 'tis but 5 days elder than ourselves." It's a very comforting view. Now, 2 centuries later, the Earth was immense. We now know billions of years, and human history is this tiny little segment at the end. The part of the history of the Earth that human beings occupy, as you all know, is so minuscule that really the only way to talk about it is in metaphor. I don't know of a single teacher of an introductory course who does not discuss it in metaphor. So I don't think there's any other way we can get it into the gut. So you will hear a teacher talk about the cosmic year. You've all heard it, with humans arising on December 31st at 11:30 at night or whatever. Or the teacher will walk out from behind his podium and say, "Consider this to be the length of Earth history. It starts over there, and humans arise right here." But my favorite of all is John McPhee in Basin and Range, who says, "Consider the history of the Earth as the length of the Old English yard, which is the distance from the king's nose to the tip of his outstretched finger." And he says, "One stroke of a nail file against the third finger removes human history." I'll read you my favorite statement. I'll read you two, actually. This is Mark Twain, the incomparable Mark Twain, commenting on what the knowledge of that, which I call geology's most frightening fact, means with respect to the biases and our whole concept of ourselves and our importance on the Earth. Twain's writing soon after the construction of the Eiffel Tower, which was then the tallest freestanding structure on Earth, right? "Man has been here 32,000 years. That it took 100 million years to prepare the world for him." Now, you know those dates are too short, but the proportion's just about right. Twain didn't pull them out of a hat. Those were Lord Kelvin's estimates, then current, for the age of the Earth. The dates are wrong. The proportions are about right. "Man has been here 32,000 years. That it took 100 million years to prepare the world for him is proof that that's what it was done for." I suppose it is. I don't know. If the Eiffel Tower were now representing the world's age, the skin of paint on the pinnacle knob at its summit would represent man's share of that age. And anybody would perceive that that skin was what the tower was built for. And that really expresses the whole point. Now here, much more eloquently, is Charles Lyell, expressing the same thing in 1830 in Volume 1 of the Principles of Geology, comparing Newton's expansion of the cosmos to the geologist, particularly James Hutton's expansion of time. He says, "Such views of the immensity of past time, like those unfolded by the Newtonian philosophy in regard to space, were too vast to awaken ideas of sublimity unmixed with a painful sense of our incapacity to conceive a plan of such infinite extent. Worlds are seen beyond worlds immeasurably distant from each other, and beyond them all innumerable other systems are faintly traced on the confines of the visible universe." And I think that very well expresses the dilemma in Freud's sequence, though he left us out, that geology, through the discovery of time, imposed upon human hope, human pattern seeking, and therefore reinforces the need for the biases. Now, I think of all the arguments that reinforce need for the biases, in a way, nothing stronger than this, geology's most frightening fact, the restriction of human habitation to the millimicrosecond at the end of time. Because if you take that in some literal sense, it carries the frightening implication that maybe we are a kind of accidental afterthought, not destined to be at all. Whereas the fact that we're confined to such a tiny sliver at the end of time is not problematical with respect to the biases as long as you incorporate them. After all, it doesn't matter that we've only been around for a tiny little bit if, in fact, we are the predictable, determined, fitting end of a progressive sequence, all of whose previous stages were predictably moving towards us. All right, we've been here for a little bit, so what? Everything for 4 billion years before that is part of the same process. So if you impose the biases upon interpretation of the history of life, geology's most frightening fact is mitigated. Now, look, I know that sophisticated and even not very sophisticated people do not accept the biases in their coarsest form. I think most people even with a basic geology course, would tell you, no, I don't believe in progress in that old linear sense. I don't pretend that any of you do. But I still say that those biases are folded into the way in which we think about life's history, not in the coarse, overt form, but in many ways that you don't even appreciate, and that it is necessary to recognize their characteristic as cultural hopes rather than the dictates of nature. Now, to illustrate this, I have been building up a slide collection for many years on the conventional iconographies of the representation of evolution, mostly in cartooning and advertising. Again, it was Martin Rudwick who inspired me to do this with an article on the role of iconography in the history of geology, because Martin had pointed out how often scholarship, traditional scholarship, depends upon text and ignores pictures as something that just merely illustrates text. Anyway, that's not true. Iconography is, in fact, a very important component. In some respects, iconography shows biases much more clearly because people are very conscious of what they write. They often don't think about what they're folding in to pictorial representations. Now, I think that advertising and cartooning, and of course I build up this collection in part because the slides have humorous value, but there's a serious point to be made and a reason for choosing cartooning and advertising because, and I have a lot of slides also from technical publications as well, but I think the reason particularly for cartooning and advertising is that more than any other professions, these two absolutely require that attention be fixed to the product in the millisecond that everybody grants it. You flip the pages of a newspaper, you don't read the ad of the cartoon unless that iconographic depiction immediately strikes you with understanding. And therefore, like no other professions, these two must choose the canonical iconographies that everybody will grasp. If you want to know what the canonical iconography is, what everybody understands, look at that. So now I'm going to show you a whole series of slides. Some of you who've heard me talk have seen these before, but I got a lot of new ones this time. So let's look at the first series of slides. This is not a new one, but let's see if we got a pointer. We got a pointer, but it doesn't work. They never do, you know. Maybe it'll work if I turn it on. Yeah. This was the back cover of TV Guide several years ago, and I'm trying to show two things here. The conventional iconography, see, there are two different issues in evolution. One are trends in form, and the other is the history of diversity. And I want to argue there are two conventional iconographies which are profoundly wrong and based in the biases that make it impossible for us to understand the nature of history itself as it applies to the history of life. What this has to do with human ethics and values will mostly become clear at tomorrow's lectures, though I'll have a passing comment on that in a moment. These two lectures are fundamentally about the nature of history as opposed to the canonical use of the biases, and I think there are implications for our views of human nature, most of which are explored tomorrow night. And the two conventional iconographies I want to show you are first what I call the ladder of progress, and secondly, and that's with respect to trends, and secondly what I call the cone, C-O-N-E, of increasing diversity, which is the analog of the ladder of progress for the history of increase in diversity rather than progress in form. This is the back cover of TV Guide many years ago, and this is to illustrate that in the vernacular the word evolution means progress. If it didn't, this ad would make no sense. Doral's theory of evolution is obviously the improvement of their cigarette. If you don't read it that way, the ad doesn't work. Now, what I find wonderfully ironic about this is that if you understood what the term evolution really means to professionals, then this ad would be true, but it would totally undermine Doral's intent, because evolution is adaptation to changing environment with no implication of cosmic improvement, and that's what's happening. You're getting addition of the filter to counter the publicity of health problems with cigarette smoking. That's all the improvement represents, which is adaptation to changing circumstances, nothing to do with improvement. So if you read it right, it would undermine the whole ad. Now, this was recently 2 months running in the New Yorker. Many of you probably saw it. These are two ads from Sebago showing the evolution into their loafers of various more primitive modes of locomotion. Here's the theory of what? Golf ball evolution. For a mere $100 from one of those catalogs you get in the junk mail all the time, you too can own for your desk the perfect executive gift of this series of improvement in golf balls. This was, our transformation into a business bank didn't happen overnight. And what is evolutionary transformation? It meanders from the amoeba to the flatworm, all the way up through this single heterogeneous column of forms up to the modern businessman. Now we look at some, now these are from professional publications, and they say, these are some older ones, and we'll look at some modern ones. This is Henry Fairfield Osborn in the 1920s, showing the linear improvement in the size of the brain as the fundamental trend of human mental evolution, presumably going from a chimpanzee, who you realize is not ancestral, but is as far from the common ancestor of chimps and humans as we are, to the only genuine fossil on our lineage in the group, namely Homo erectus, to Piltdown, which is particularly interesting because you know, of course, that Piltdown was a fraud built of a modern cranium. And since it was a modern cranium, it had a modern cranial capacity, yet so convinced were many of the people at the time that a human ancestor would be intermediate, they actually managed to reconstruct what is in fact the modern cranium as appropriately intermediate to Neanderthal, who's presumably not on our lineage at all, and who anyway had a somewhat larger brain, if anything, than ours, up to modern Homo sapiens. And this, if the laughter comes from some of the older members of the audience, you probably remember these from your courses. These are the famous McGregor busts, which used to adorn almost every anthropology department in the country. You can probably find some here, I don't know. But this is Homo erectus, Trinnell, Java man of the old literature. This is Neanderthal, and that's Cro-Magnon. Now the problem is that Neanderthal is not an intermediary form, presumably a collateral branch that lived in Europe while our actual ancestry probably remained in Africa. It's very hard to reconstruct Neanderthal as intermediate. It's difficult. In so many ways it's not. It doesn't fit. And look what McGregor has done here to enhance the difficulty of depicting something that's collateral as intermediate. I don't know to what extent he's even aware of the way these biases get folded into iconography. You'll notice that Cro-Magnon is clean-shaven while Neanderthal is a 3-day growth, which clearly enhances the impression. Just to show you that it's not just the bad old days of McGregor and company, this is from the best modern textbook on human evolution, Campbell's Mankind Evolving. It is the linear sequence of human evolution from the chimp in the trees, who is not ancestral, to stoop-shouldered Australopithecus, though we've known since the 20s they walked about as erect as us, all the way up, literally the march of evolution, to human form, including things that are clearly unconscious, like the folding into this of the racist theme of the lightening of skin color as we approach modernity, which I'm quite confident was not part of the intent of the artist, and yet something one does automatically. This is to show that it's quite cross-cultural. I bought this in the Bazaar of Agra a few years ago. Now, this is now to show in cartooning some of the uses of this iconography of the March of Progress. So here we have world terrorism parachuting into its appropriate place. And this is a Portuguese version of Frank and Ernest. The American version has a rock star here, but we see from amoeba to worm to frog to dog, monkey, human, and carioca is the last one. The evolution of the nerve. This was a Christmas card I got this year. Oh yeah, that's a comment on creationism, as the creationist is in his appropriate place in the sequence. Earth is only 10,000 years old. That was before the last Patriots-Raiders football game. That's from the Boston Globe, the last time the Raiders played the Patriots. Oh yeah, this is a new one. I don't know whether you can read this, and I don't know what Mr. Kennedy thinks about censorship, but anyway, here's the For those in the front row who can read it, I won't bother simply to say it. You can, this is the history of sex. This is Mike Peters' comment on sexism. Here's the response that I found in Hamilton College up on the... Now here's a series that shows them going the other way. There's a lot of that also, you know, from hunter to plowman to mechanic to couch potato. Or this, very much the same theme. This one I like because it's times arrow and times cycle. Here's a person who understands recursion, right? Now, these I'm really embarrassed about. This is, you know, I've spent my whole career fighting these biases, right? But I have no control whatever over the design of foreign translations of my books. And it's always interested me that so many of my books carry this iconography, though the content within is, if anything, dedicated to refuting it. Here's the French translation of the panda's thumb. And here's the Portuguese translation of Ever Since Darwin. And here's the Dutch translation of Ever Since Darwin. And here's a talk I gave at Tulane. You know, you can't escape it. It's the only iconography anyone knows for illustrating. Now here's a really good example. I'm going to go on this forever. This is the next to the last one. Here's my buddy Richard Leakey. I guess he got a free Rolex. They tell me they're pretty expensive for this. But this is terrific because whoever wrote the copy for this actually got it right. You know, sometimes it happens. Look what it says. It says, human evolution was commonly considered an unbroken chord. His discoveries confirm more complex lines of descent. And that's right, as Tim White will tell us, one of our other commentators. That's exactly right. That's, if you wanted to epitomize Leakey's work and Tim's work and others in a sentence, that's what it does. But look how they drew it. They don't know any other way. The drawing belies the correct statement. We don't know what else to do. Okay, now here's the last example, because those were all the ladder of progress. And I'm sorry I don't have more slides of the alternate, which is the cone of increasing diversity. Here is one example. In the model of the cone of increasing diversity, because a lot of the second part of the talk is meant to be a refutation of this. In the branch angles of some 20 degrees. So in a sense, it has to develop as it does, right? There only was this restricted set of possibilities. You have to grow up the funnel, and this is pretty much what has to happen. This is the counterpart in diversity of the ladder of progress for form. Now, I might want the lights, but let me see where I am. Wait a minute. Can't see a damn thing here. I have to have the lights, but we may want them off again. No, tell you what, you can, well, okay. Just got to see where I am. Okay, let's leave them on for a bit. You can turn that off. Now, look, I don't want to push this too far. Could you turn that off? We don't need to stand it. If you, now you can say to me, and quite rightly, but sure, I admit there's no ladder of progress. The cone of increasing diversity is wrong. But in some sense, isn't it true that there is a progressive character to life through the ages? After all, a couple billion years ago, there was nothing but single-celled prokaryotic creatures of the simplest design. Then we got more complex eukaryotic cells, then we got multicellular organisms, then we got invertebrates, then we got fishes. I mean, isn't that right? So sure, it isn't a linear sequence. But in some broad sense, if I step way back, I do see that ladder of progress, don't I? And, you know, I don't want to push my counter-argument too far, except to suggest a few things, that if there was a kind of predictable gradual necessity to it all, the actual pattern, you see, the story breaks down entirely as soon as you know something about the details of the fossil record. And our third commentator, Jim Valentine, is an expert precisely on those subjects, of those details, particularly the early details of the record of animal life, which is why I asked for him as one of the commentators. The story just breaks down. It doesn't work when you know the details. If it was all so necessary and predictable, why does about 2/3 of the history of life consist of nothing but the simplest prokaryotic single-celled organisms, that is, creatures without organelles, without nuclei, without mitochondria. Why 1.4 billion years ago, when you get the first eukaryotes, that is, the more complex single-celled creatures with nuclei and chromosomes and mitochondria, why do they not aggregate in a kind of orderly and predictable way immediately or soon to multicellular animals? But it doesn't happen. You wait another 800 million years until you get any multicellular life. And then in one big whoosh, about 600 million years ago, a little less, you get in the so-called Cambrian explosion, we'll come back to this as a particular example, essentially all modern basic anatomies of the fossil record. And since then, despite some marvelous little tinkerings of inventions like consciousness, there has not been the evolution or the extinction of any basic phyla of animal life. The story just doesn't work as the biases tell it once you delve into the details. And I'll say one other thing, and then I want to get off that subject. You're looking at an exceedingly peculiar and biased subset of fossils if you even think you can talk about a sequence that goes prokaryote, eukaryote, invertebrate, fish, mammal, human. I mean, that's not an evolutionary lineage. What are you looking at when you say, you're not looking, these organisms aren't even related. You're looking at, if you made a curve of complexity along one axis and just a regular frequency distribution, you'd be looking at the right tail. If the right tail goes to complexity and the left tail, stage left, is simplicity. Look, for chemical and physical reasons having to do with theories of the origin of life, life almost necessarily originates at the absolute lower limit of its preservable complexity, right? So life originates as some minimally fossilizable single-celled creature. Now, it can't get any simpler because it's originating right by the lower limit of potential complexity. All that can happen through time is that every once in a while you're going to add more complex creatures. That doesn't mean that the thrust of life is inexorably and predictably moving in that direction. It just means every once in a while you get a few odd creatures at the right tail of complexity. You know, the modal organism on Earth has always been a prokaryotic cell. It's never changed. It's no different now. There are more E. coli in the gut of every individual in this room than there are human beings on Earth. The modal organism has always been a prokaryotic cell. All that's happened is every once in a while you add something in the only direction in which life could conceivably expand, given the necessary point of its origin at the lower limit of conceivable complexity. That's all it is, even if you're inclined to look at the story that way. So what I'd like to suggest is that we really need a totally different conceptualization of the pattern and pathways of evolutionary change. Now, if we look at our textbooks again, we don't get very many good hints. If we're looking for a conceptualization through standard depictions of the nature of evolution, because what do you see? You open your textbooks and you get a picture of a peppered moth, or a butterfly that beautifully mimics another one, or an ichthyosaur that looks ever so much like a fish, though it's a reptile. And you are told that natural selection, that the mills of natural selection may grind exceedingly slow but very fine indeed. And you very much get the impression that at least in individual lineages, there's a kind of predictable adaptive perfection of end forms, and natural selection gets there. Now, these examples are not false. There are probably many such examples of genuine optimization in the history of life, but I think since those are what we almost always get as depictions of the workings of evolution in our textbook examples, we get this very false impression that that's what natural selection is about, that natural selection is a theory at least of local optimization of form, and it just isn't that at all when you look at broad scale. So I'm going to give you an alternate canonical iconography. I'll give you what I think ought to be the more representative examples. So here's my suggestion. I'll give you two cases, and I'll tell you what I think they mean, and then you'll finally see why I picked this theme for the TANA lectures, and then you're going to have to bear with me for 4 examples. And as I always tell audiences, I have a natural length of 1 hour and 20 minutes. That's just how long I talk. So, you know, when you get nervous after 1 hour and 10 minutes, I know what I'm doing. If you don't like it, you can leave. That's okay. But I'm not overstaying my concept of my time. If it's other people's concept, I'm sorry. Okay, let's look at the next slide. This example comes from my friend Elizabeth Verba at Yale. It's an African heron who uses its wings primarily to shade the water in order to see its prey. And it works really well. If you didn't know anything about the history of this form, you might say, now I know what wings are for, or why wings are there. They shade the water so well this animal can feed. And that's in a sense why I show you this example. Because this kind of example of structures that may work perfectly well, but when you delve into and understand their history, you realize that there's this massive, quirky, functional shift going on, unpredictable, odd changes that no matter how well the design works today, we'll get into this with the human brain tomorrow, that no matter how well the design works today, that has precious little to do with the contingencies, the peculiarities, the unpredictabilities, the non-determinisms of its history that you just can't infer from current workings, anything like the set of biases we would like to read into historical origin. Now, the wing is the classic example of that. And it's Darwin's classic example. That's why I show this. Darwin was attacked by St. George Mivart, his most cogent critic by his own reckoning, with what Mivart called, in technical parlance, the problem of the incipient stages of useful structures. That's a lot of jargon. I like to call it the 10% of a wing problem. The issue is this, namely, once you have a wing, it's perfectly easy to see what it's doing for an organism and why natural selection might favor and preserve it. But since 10% of a wing can't possibly fly, if you're committed to continuationism in evolution, how do you ever get there? Since the incipient stages of the useful structure can't work as the completed device, how do you ever get there? Now, Darwin's response to that, which is embodied in a principle that goes by a very poor name, pre-adaptation today, but is, I think, basically the correct response, holds that Mivart's argument is indeed correct, and that the incipient stages had to be used for something else that would be useful at small intermediary sizes, and that when the wing, having initially evolved as something else, became large enough so that it could begin to function in flight, it could then be co-opted for this second function. Now, there's been a century of debate since that argument has been accepted as to what that initial function of the wing might have been. Thermoregulation, since birds evolved from the smallest lineage of dinosaurs, and it's small animals who, by surface volume considerations, have the greatest problem with thermoregulation, that argument does seem to make sense. There's now good experimental data on insects, for which the same problem exists, illustrating that indeed incipient stages that have no function in flying work very well indeed as accessory thermoregulatory devices. So let's accept that that's a plausible argument, I don't know whether it's right, namely that the wing initially evolves for thermoregulation, then co-opted for flight. Then for 100 million years or more, the ancestors of this heron fly with the wing. And then there's this second co-optation, this double quirky functional shift, whereby the wing, having been used for 100 million years for flight, is co-opted again for this mantling behavior. And now I think you have the issue, which is why I nominate this creature as your better iconography for understanding the contingent pathways of evolutionary history. Namely, that if I could send you back in a time machine to the period when the ancestors of birds had the incipient wings for thermoregulation, could you ever, this makes sense, but could you ever have predicted it? Would you ever have known? Is there any inference to be made from the good design of the mantling wing today to its double and odd quirky functional shift? Would you ever have known that a device working perfectly well for thermoregulation was subject 50 million years down the road to co-optation as a wing for a flying creature, as it never happened in the vertebrate line before that? In other words, what happened makes sense after it happens, but is quite unpredictable at the moment. Would you have gone back to the Cretaceous and seen, first of all, you shouldn't be taping this at all. Secondly, I'd appreciate it if you, okay. Second, could you possibly have predicted in the Cretaceous that that this mantling behavior 60 million years later would finally evolve? And the answer is, of course not, even though it works perfectly well. Now, the best example from human anatomy, I think most of you know, is the evolution of the auditory ossicles. If your ear specialist told you, and I'm perfectly willing to believe it, that the malleus, incus, and stapes, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup of your middle ear, were beautifully and optimally designed to transmit sound, as they may be. I don't know whether they are or not, but if I'm told that, I'm perfectly willing to believe it. My response would be, that's fine, and it's very interesting, but it has precious little to do with the quirky character of functional shifts that characterize the evolutionary history of those ossicles, because thanks to the fossil record in embryology, we know that history in outline. And it's an even more bizarre story of unpredictable functional shift. Let's consider first the stapes, the stirrup. It begins in the jawless ancestors of fishes as one of the bones supporting the gill arches. There's no jaw yet. Then it becomes, in fishes, once the jaw arises, a bone called the hyomandibula that suspends the upper jaw to the brain case. In amphibians and reptiles, it moves into the ear as the single hearing bone to this day, the stapes of amphibians and reptiles. So from gill arch bone to jaw suspensory bone to hearing bone. Meanwhile, the malleus and incus, the hammer and the anvil, also begin as gill arch bones. With the evolution of the jaw, they move forward, because gill arches form the jaws, to become, as they still are in reptiles, the articulatory bones, called quadrate and articular, that hinge the jaw. In the evolution of mammals, the bone which is foremost in the reptiles, the dennary, enlarges and pushes back until it becomes the only lower jaw bone of mammals. The quadrate and articular are pushed out into the middle ear, and a new joint is formed between the dentary and the squamosal. So, to recoup, the stapes begins as a gill arch support bone, becomes a jaw suspensory bone, enters the ear of amphibians. The malleus and incus begin as gill arch bones, become jaw hinging bones, and in mammals move into the middle ear. Sure, they may work beautifully today, but again, I send you back 450 million years, 500 million years to the ancestry of these jawless fishes. Would you have looked at these bones functioning perfectly well as gill arch supports and said, aha, I know that 400 million years later, in a group called the mammals, they're going to undergo all these shifts and end up in the middle ear, by which I will know from their good design for sure that that's what they were meant to do. No, it's another one of these quirky, contingent, functional shifts that you never could have predicted, though they make sense afterwards. Now, at this point, let me take 5 minutes or so. I'll have the lights, and turn that off, to sketch a little bit where I'm going with these lectures. And then I've got my 4 examples, and that'll end this. You see, what I'm trying to suggest is that we get rid of these biases quite consciously, which are only ways of supporting our hopes in the light of geology's most frightening fact and Freud's observation about the history of science, that we seriously take the message in the iconography of the heron and the ear bones and try better to understand the nature of unpredictability in the history of life, which is not regulated by those biases, but which is intensely peculiar. Now, the problem is that the human mind dichotomizes. So, if I stand here and tell you the world is not, the history of life doesn't look like subsumption under the laws of nature. That is, you can't say, here are natural laws. From those laws, I can predict the actual upward course under the principle of natural selection of evolution leading to the human mind. By our tendencies to dichotomize, if you accept that position, many people will say, aha, he must be saying that everything's random. And I mean in the vernacular sense of chaotic, which is also a vernacular reading of a word that has a different technical meaning now current. So if I don't mean that everything's deterministic under the biases, I must mean that it's just capricious and accidental and there's no pattern and we might as well go home and get drunk or something rather than try and understand it. But these dichotomies are a very poor way to look at the world. You can't order all ranges of opinions on a line. And the alternative that I want to suggest is not some wishy-washy something in between randomness and determinism. It's just a different position off that imaginary line, which I think is the message of history. It is the theme of contingency. The world makes sense. It's enormously complex. It's full of random elements. What happens makes sense. That is, after it happens, if the density of historical information be great enough, and it often isn't, that's just the impoverished nature of the record, but that's a problem in all historical reconstruction. If the density of evidence be great enough, one can explain what happened. It's not an accident. What happened makes sense. It can be reconstructed, but it's not subsumable and predictable under the laws of nature. It's a complex, unrepeatable, unpredictable set of historical contingencies in which what happens at the end is so critically dependent on each of the thousands of antecedent steps, each happening as they did, no one of which had to happen that way, that if you could in fact do the great thought experiment, which unfortunately we can't, of erasing life's tape, running it all back and letting it go again, would you ever, that's the great experiment, would you ever, that's why everybody's interested in exobiology, it's the closest we can get to that other experiment if we ever find anything. If you could run the tape of life again, would you get anything on the surface of this planet like what we have? Under the biases, of course you would. You can get something very close to it. All this is predictable. Under contingency, you'd never get anything even close to what we see. But you wouldn't get chaos. You'd get a totally different result. It would be equally explainable. The only problem is that the chance of it including any conscious creature desiring to explain it would be very small indeed. So that's the issue. That's contingency. That's what history's like. And tomorrow's talk is about the analysis of human nature in terms of the historian's theme of contingency. Now, some people get disappointed because we're trained in this hierarchical status ordering of sciences to think of subsumption under nature's laws as better, as more elegant, as a deeper kind of explanation, and of historical contingency as somehow less preferable and messier. It's not true. It's just as interesting, it's just as real, it's just as good an explanation. If I tell you that the biological equality of human races is merely a contingency of the way in which our history happened to work its way out, and that is indeed correct as far as we can tell, that doesn't make it any less elegant or persuasive an argument than if I told you that from first principles of natural selection I can predict the equality of races, which is not true. I mean, contingent things that work out as they do for reasons of history's contingencies are just as rich and exciting and interesting and as well explained as those that are directly subsumable under laws of nature. They're just different styles of explanation. So these two lectures are about historical contingency. They're about unpredictability in that sense, which is not randomness, but it's the historian's contingent sense of unpredictability. Now, I also like this theme because in university context, it's one of the best illustrations I know of the necessarily interdisciplinary character of this enterprise of ours, because given the biases, not the ones the four I was talking about, but biases about the status orderings of science, where the stereotypical model of physics is subsumption under simple laws of nature, is held as an ideal, contingency is almost never taught. There are realms of historical sciences, like cosmology and paleontology and geology and large parts of evolutionary biology that are sort of downgraded in this status order. We don't learn very much about contingency in science. Of course, if you want to study contingency, it's a theme much better exploited by humanists, by filmmakers, by authors, by novelists than by scientists, and that's where you have to look for guidance. If you want to understand contingency, you read Tolstoy's second preface to War and Peace, which is all about it. If you like modern novels, you read Kurt Vonnegut's Galapagos, which is all about how by some crazy set of circumstances the entire future of the human race is lodged in a heterogeneous collection of a few people on a boat somewhere off in the Galapagos, and that's why history moves that way. You read Steve King's Tommyknockers, or you look at some of our better films. You look at Back to the Future, and you look at Marty McFly struggling to unite his parents because he knows that if he can't do it, that the most ultimate of consequences, namely his own erasure, will ensue. And in order to bring them together, what he has to do is to make a few utterly trivial things come out. Well, they are trivial at the moment because that's the lesson of contingency, the things that seem utterly unimportant for the moment can be those tiny little changes that send history cascading down different pathways. It's the theme of the most famous scene in the film Everybody Watches on Christmas Eve, It's a Wonderful Life, where Jimmy Stewart's angel, Clarence Oddbody, Stewart George Bailey, as you remember, is about to commit suicide to get the money from an insurance policy that will save his failed and bankrupt business, and he's about to do this because he claims his life has been utterly insignificant. He was a man who had dreams, he was never able to fulfill them. He's ended up running this savings and loan, now a relevant theme again in this little town in the Midwest, and Clarence Oddbody, his angel, says, no, you're wrong, that's not true. Your life has not been insignificant. I'll prove it to you. I'll show you what life would have been like in your town of Bedford Falls if you'd never been born. And Stewart, of course, is convinced it can't make any difference at all. His life's been utterly insignificant. And then follows this marvelous scene, which you know, of what life in Bedford Falls would have been like. Now, I think people miss one of the themes that I'm sure Copper was trying to capture in that scene. The theme that everybody sees is that, A, it's very, very different, and it's very much uglier. That is, everybody is much worse off by virtue of George Bailey's non-birth. In significant and important ways, everybody's quality of life is enormously diminished. The theme I think people miss is that the alternate rendition makes just as much sense. Oh, it's infinitely uglier, but it's perfectly sensible. It's a definite outcome of the conditions in that town. The only difference is George Bailey's absence. And he understands and wants his life back, and that's the whole point. And I think that, to me, is as good a representation of this theme of contingency as any. Now, the last part of this talk, and what this has to do with ethics and values, I hope we'll try and make, I don't fundamentally know in any deep sense, but I think it has implications for the way in which we think. Look, I don't think that the factual state of the world can directly say anything about the proper mode of moral behavior. But I do think that an understanding of the contingencies involved in our evolution can enlighten the way in which we think about these issues. Now, the last part of this talk tries to, since I'm speaking for a philosophy department, you always have to learn people's jargons, right? And one word that philosophers like a lot, and it's wonderful because it joins the Empyrean heights of philosophy with Adam Smith, right? Philosophers always talk about cashing out your examples, so I've been told. So I'm going to have to cash out this theme of contingency by showing you that it actually works. Lisa is the one who taught me that term, who's grimacing in the front row, but I know you're not the only one who uses it. But I have to show you that at least there are alternate scenarios in the history of life. I mean, what good is all this lecture on contingency if I can't even now specify what some alternate runnings of life's tape might have yielded? I mean, maybe it sounds great, but there really is only one pathway. Maybe from the beginning of prokaryotic life, there's a predictable sort of movement regardless of what I say. Let me just give you 4 examples. It could be hundreds. I choose these 4 because they're crucial points of decision-making, if you will, where things could have gone any one of a number of ways. And I choose these points because, at least for the last 3, there's astoundingly interesting new data that very few people know anything about for other reasons that have to do with status orderings that I don't have time to go into. So let's consider 4 crucial points under the experiment of replaying life's tape, and let's consider how predictable, according to the biases, the history of life looks. And then tomorrow we'll try and take a look in the small at the human mind and human nature in the same context. All right, so we go back to the beginnings of life as recorded in the fossil record, the single-celled prokaryotic organisms that you first find in the fossil record about 3.6 billion years ago. Very close to the origin of life, because the Earth was molten some 3.8 to 3.9 billion years ago, so it has to have occurred in that couple 100 million years. And for more than 2 billion years, that's all you have. For more than 2 billion years, the highest, if I may use that term of bias, I've avoided it up to now, form of life is what's called a stromatolite. Now, stromatolite is not a living object itself. A stromatolite is cabbage-like structures you find in the early fossil record, are mats of sediment trapped and bound by single-celled prokaryotic creatures. So there's a macroscopic fossil representation in terms of these sediment mats. They're called stromatolites. For 2 billion years, they are the most complex visible form of organic activity on the surface of this planet. And that's more than half the history of life, a good deal, almost 2/3 of the history of life. That's all you have in terms of organic complexity. Now, somebody would say to me, okay, but look, you know, that's all you had for 2 billion years, but time is infinite, time goes on forever, so eventually maybe it could have taken 10 or 20 billion years instead of the 2 it did take, maybe that was lucky and contingent, but eventually it's going to happen, right? Well, that's not right, and that's the whole point of this first story, which is a short one. Namely, that time is long, but it's not infinite. No vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, Hutton tells us, but that doesn't mean there's no beginning, and there's no vestige of a beginning because it's not recorded in evidence, and there's no prospect of an end because it's not part of the mechanics of the cycle. But yes, there are beginnings and ends. It's not infinite, it's just long. And of course, therefore, the length of Earth history is set by the possible duration of the sun. And so we have to ask our cosmologist friends how long the sun's going to burn. And nobody can give us a date or a time, but most estimates I see say 10 to 12 billion years for the total history of a star like our sun, after which it explodes, extends out to about the orbit of Jupiter as a red giant, and that's the end of the Earth. Whether life on Earth can then go off elsewhere in spaceships doesn't concern me for the moment. Point is, that's the end of the Earth. So you don't have forever, you see. If you had forever, it would be fine, but you don't have forever. You've got a long but limited amount of time to aggregate to consciousness. Now, isn't it striking? When I first when I first recognized this, it really stunned me. Look, consciousness arose yesterday, right? The Earth's about 5 billion years old, a little less. Sun's going to last about 10. In other words, it took, empirically, about half the potential history of this Earth to build consciousness on it. That's a large fraction of the potential history of the Earth. And given the error margins and the error bars around any event, that gives you no confidence at all that something like consciousness is determined to arise. It took half the potential time to get consciousness on the surface of this planet. And the error bars are probably orders of magnitude, not doublings. So you rerun the tape of life, you get prokaryotes again. That probably is predictable under basics, physics, and chemistry. You get your prokaryotes, you get your stromatolites, but this time stromatolites don't aggregate to eukaryotic and then to multicellular complexity. The sun explodes at 10 billion years, leaving as its highest mute witness to this cosmic catastrophe the algal mat that has been there for 10 billion years, that would 6 billion years later have aggregated to multicellular complexity, but it never had a chance. Perfectly plausible alternative scenario. So we move on to case number 2. Namely, you might say, fine, I'll buy that. That's okay. You're right. There's a lot of contingency there, but surely I'll grant you contingency. But once you get up to multicellular life, then everything's predictable, isn't it? You know, you got to have bilateral symmetry, you got to have the sensory organs up front and the excretory organs behind, and everything's got to be bilateral, and you move forward. Surely once you get to multicellular complexity, you've got the basic outlines of anatomy. Isn't there, don't you then enter the funnel of the cone of increasing diversity? And my answer to that is it's no longer anywhere near so necessarily so. That is the traditional interpretation. So let me tell you story number 2. Story number 2 is about the Earth's first multicellular fauna. Now for stories 2 and 3, we get into the area of Jim's expertise. The first multicellular fauna occurs in rocks about 650 million years old. This is the only multicellular fauna that occurs before the famous Cambrian explosion. It's in the Cambrian explosion, which is that short period of a few million years, during which the modern multicellular designs first enter the fossil record some 570, 550 million years ago, in around there. There is one Precambrian multicellular fauna, but lest you think there has been a major discombobulation of the notion that it all pretty much happens in the Cambrian explosion, not really, because this one Precambrian multicellular fauna is just barely Precambrian. It exists in the very latest Precambrian rocks. The fauna, called Ediacara, is named after a locality in Australia, Ediacara, where it was first found, but it is a worldwide fauna, so we're not talking about a local peculiarity. This is the multicellular life on Earth as we know it, just before the Cambrian explosion. Now, is there predictable, necessary advance? Has life entered the base of the funnel for the cone of increasing diversity once you get the Ediacara fauna? That's how it was traditionally interpreted. Let's look at that traditional interpretation and consider an alternative hypothesis. So we'll look at the next slide. Now, this is a famous drawing from Scientific American, 1959, showing the traditional interpretation under the model of the cone of increasing diversity of the Ediacara fauna, in which each element in the Ediacara fauna is interpreted as a simple precursor within a modern group. So some of them are called soft corals, some of them are called worms, arthropods, some of them are called worms. That way of looking at life's history under the biases. About 6, 7 years ago, our colleague Adolf Seilacher, one of the world's great observational paleontologists from the University of Tübingen, presented a radical interpretation of Ediacara. I do not know whether he's right. When I get to my third story, I'm absolutely convinced that the radical interpretation is correct, and I think all my colleagues are. This is more tentative. This old explanation may be basically right, for all I know, but here's an alternative view, not developed by Seilacher to tout the theme of contingency. I don't think he's thought of it in those terms, but based on observations he made. Now, first of all, this story never really worked all that well anyway, because there were always some oddballs in the Ediacara that nobody could attribute to a modern group. There's this form called Tribrachidium, this little disc-like structure with 3 arms. There's this form called Parvancorina, which is bilaterally symmetrical. The central axis doesn't look like much of anything that we can recognize, but virtually everything else was placed into modern groups. Now, Seilacher's argument, I'll have to recount it very briefly because time's a wasting, basically has 2 parts. There's the negative part, which says that if you look at these in functional detail, none of them could really work like their supposed modern counterparts, and therefore they were not the ancestors of their supposed modern counterparts. The positive argument is that if you take all the Ediacara creatures together, they all share certain common features of design, indicating, and now I'll give away the punchline, that they represent a totally separate experiment in multicellular life and not ancestral forms to what now exists in our oceans. So I just give you one example. I was going to go through 3, but I'll just give you one of Seilacher's mode of analysis. Now, here's a form which has always been called a jellyfish, that is a simple selenorate from the Ediacara. Seilacher says, yes, indeed, it has superficially the structures of selenorates. Selenorates are radially symmetrical, and they have both concentric and radial structures, as this does. But it's all backwards in this creature. In a jellyfish, the concentric structures are on the outside because they're muscle bands that move the animal. In this creature, the concentric structures are on the inside, but they couldn't work that way. In a jellyfish, the radial structures are grooves that bring food to a central mouth. Therefore, they have to be on the inside. In this creature, there are radial grooves, but they're on the outside, so they can't be bringing food to a central mouth. So whatever this is, it just couldn't work like a jellyfish, and presumably wasn't one. Now, Seilacher goes through a similar argument with this kind of form, which has been called a soft coral, and this very long, not the specimen, these get up to 1 meter long, Dickinsonia, which has been called a worm. It is bilaterally symmetrical, but these are not segments, and indeed they imbricate. They don't meet as segments would in the midline. That's the negative argument. As the positive argument embodied in this taxonomic scheme, Seilacher says, once you get rid of the old conceptual straitjacket, the old shoehorn, which made you taxonomize every Ediacaran creature into a known group, and I never had understood the power of taxonomy as an organizing scheme of thought, not merely as a neutral hat rack for placing the facts of nature, until I saw this, because I realized I had never seen the unity that Seilacher perceived, because all my life I've been trained to see this animal as an echinoderm, this animal is a worm, this one is an arthropod, this is a coral. This is as a jellyfish, and I never saw what was common to them because I allocated them to their separate phyla. Now, what Zeilacher says is that all of them share certain characteristics. First of all, they're flat as a pancake, and secondly, they're complexly quilted. And all that differ among them are the symmetry styles. There are radially symmetrical ones, they're bipolar or bilateral, and what he calls unipolar or leaf-like, coming from a... But beyond those three symmetry classes, they're all flat as a pancake and complexly quilted. Now, what does that suggest? To Zeilacher, it suggests, now think about it, there are basically structurally only two ways to build a large multicellular organism, given Galileo's fundamental constraint that surfaces increase as the square of length and volumes as the cube. Therefore, if shape doesn't change, surfaces grow much more slowly than volumes, and you run into enormous difficulties because organic functions go through surfaces but have to serve the entire volume. Now, there's only two ways to get around that, to get adequate surface with respect to volume at large sizes. One is what we all do. It is the solution of the modern metazoa, the modern complex multicellular animals. That is, you evolve internal complexity and retain roughly globular shapes at large sizes. I mean, your lungs functionally are just a big bag of surface area. The villi on your small intestine the same. But there's another solution taken by very few modern animals. There are some parasites like tapeworms that do, but it's not a common solution. Namely, you evolve no internal complexity, but change the external body shape in such a way that nothing on the outside is very far from the inside, and then use the outside body surface for all surface-dependent functions. And that's what Zeilacher thinks Ediacara represents. He thinks it represents a whole separate experiment that used the other style of multicellular life. Now, think about it. Tapeworm's okay, it's inside a body, it's protected. But if you're 3 feet long and flat as a pancake in the world full of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortunes on the tide lines, you better develop some protective devices, and that's what Zeilacher thinks the complex quilting is. It's a way to be able to be flat as a pancake and a couple feet long. Now, I simply put it to you, if Zeilacher is right, I don't know whether he is, then this is a whole separate experiment. This is what the Earth's first multicellular life looked like. Replay the tape of life back into the Ediacara. Now, if Ediacara was traditionally interpreted correctly, then what do you got? You got the ancestors of modern forms. Replay it back to then, they'll go the same way they went. But if Zeilacher is right, push the tape of life back here, and maybe this is all you ever get. Maybe this is the solution that comes to dominate multicellular life. And I don't think there's much possibility for the evolution of consciousness given the second strategy. Flat as a pancake, a couple feet long on the ocean floor, I don't think includes the possibility of being here to wonder about it very much. And maybe this would happen. Who's to say it couldn't? All right, now let me get to the third and by far the most interesting of the stories. Don't worry, the fourth story, although it's a very important one, is about 2 sentences long, so I will not go over my time. This is the most important story that has been developed within paleontology probably in this century. It is the most reformative, if that's a word, of our entire view of the history of life. It has been virtually invisible in public notice, and that is a profound comment on science journalism, on the nature of what's reported, on the status ordering of the sciences. Because I ask you, as I tell you this story, why has this not been picked up and reported? I felt this so keenly, I've just written a book on it myself, but why has it not been reported? And I think the answer can only be because it's appeared as descriptive work in taxonomic monographs that do not have high status and is not viewed and seen by science journalists, but it's more important than Alvarez, is more important than mass extinction theory for our understanding of life's history. And this has to do with the first multicellular faunas of the Cambrian explosion. You see, my hypothetical antagonist would say, that was a really interesting story about Ediacara. Okay, I buy that. You're right. You could wind the tape back to the Ediacara, let it play again, you'd never get anything else. But surely, once you get, all right, you didn't have to get to the Cambrian explosion and get the modern designs, but once you got them, then surely you entered the cone. and it was necessary. Once you got the Cambrian explosion, I mean, we know it, right? You got trilobites and simple snails and brachiopods. The products of the Cambrian explosion are just a few simple representatives of what came later. Surely then, predictability enters, contingency is gone, and you know what's going to happen. And the answer is, again, no. And the reason, and this time there's good evidence. It's not Xyloch's conjectural reconstruction of Ediacara. The key to this is illustrated by this next rather odd photograph. This is the greatest secretary of the Smithsonian Institution between Joseph Henry and Dillon Ripley. His name is probably unknown to almost everyone here, and that, again, if I were giving a sociology lecture on status ordering, would be a profound injustice. This is Charles Doolittle Walcott, also the greatest paleontologist of his day. In 1909, Charles Doolittle Walcott made the paleontological discovery of the century. You realize that the fossil record is almost exclusively the story of organisms with hard parts. Hard parts do not give us a good insight into the full range of ancient life for two obvious reasons. First, the majority of organisms don't have any hard parts. You don't learn anything about them. Secondly, hard parts can be very uninformative. You might just get a simple cap over an organism. Therefore, you need these rare, precious, odd preservations of soft-bodied faunas to get a full sense of the range. Now, if in 1900 God had descended to the World Conference of Paleontologists and said, I'll give you half an hour, go into a huddle, I'll give you one thing that you want. What do you want? There's no question what the answer would have been. The answer would have been, please give us a soft-bodied fauna right after the Cambrian explosion, because I want to get some sense of what life was like at this crucial earliest moment of the basic rapid production of all multicellular forms. The Lord is recalcitrant, as we all know, but every once in a while he comes through. And in this case, in 1909 in Yoho National Park, that's anachronistic, it wasn't that then, on the border between British Columbia and Alberta, C.D. Walcott found a soft-bodied fauna called the Burgess Shale. The answer to that prayer. Now, the reason you've never heard about it, and this is not the fault of bad science journalism, there's a good reason why you never heard about it, and that is that C.D. Walcott, for reasons I don't have time to go into, but constitutes a fascinating story in itself, was an extremely conservative thinker who was convinced that the cone of diversity was the right model, that there was a progressive embodiment of God's creative spirit through the history of time, eventually necessarily leading up to human beings. He was virtually compelled by the power of his a priori thoughts to interpret the Burgess organisms as simple representatives of modern groups, and he therefore followed the dictates of that shoehorn, as I call it. Walcott managed to classify all Burgess Shale organisms as primitive members of modern groups. Some of them were worms, some of them were arthropods, primarily. And therefore, although every paleontologist knows about them because they're such beautiful creatures, they never entered popular consciousness because they didn't teach us anything unconventional. And so they're not very well known. 20 years ago, Harry Whittington of Cambridge University, one of the great descriptive paleontologists of our age, undertook a reinventory of the Burgess Shale, not having any expectation of anything radical. Out of that work, done by Whittington and two of his students, Simon Conway Morris and Derek Briggs, and a few other fine paleontologists, has come a fundamental revision of the Burgess fauna, whose implications are more important than anything else we've learned this century about life's history, but which is largely unknown to the general public, though it should not be. Namely, what Whittington and colleagues have shown is that although there are indeed some members of modern groups in the Burgess fauna, now the Burgess Shale is a single quarry. It's no longer than this stage. But through the taxonomic work of Whittington and his colleagues, we have learned that the Burgess Shale, one quarry in British Columbia, right after the Cambrian explosion, the Middle Cambrian, contains more diversity of basic anatomical structure than exists in the world's oceans today. In other words, the history of life is not the story of the cone of increasing diversity, where the first forms are simple and few members of groups that become more complex and more diverse later. In fact, the greatest range of anatomical opportunity occurred right at the beginning, and the history of life is a decimation of that enormous range of initial possibilities. The history of surviving groups is a history of winnowing and decimation. It's a history of extinction. We have an extinction-patterned world. It has been a restriction, not an advance. And that, of course, has profound and obvious implications for the experiment of the tape, as I'll make clear. And I cannot think of any discovery in paleontology more important than the reconstruction of the Burgess Shale. And yet I won't even ask for a show of hands. I'm sure not many of you know about it. Now, you may have hated this talk up to now, but you're going to love the next 5 minutes, because these organisms are so bizarre that you can't help but being interested in them, I guarantee you. This is just to give you some sense of the preservation. This animal is called Morella. This is the most common of Burgess Shale organisms. It's an arthropod, so we know what phylum it's in, but you see, this is a fractal story. It's not only that we have weird things that we can't place in modern phyla at all. Once you get forms that can be placed in a modern phylum, they're unknown and weird objects within it. All modern arthropods, that's 80% of all animal species, by the way, are in 3 major groups: the insect group, the spider group, and the crustacean group, each of which has a fairly stereotypical anatomical ground plan. 1 million species in 3 basic kinds of arthropods. You go into the Burgess, one quarry in British Columbia, and you have at least 13 and probably as many as 25 additional basic designs of arthropod anatomy that lost. Isn't that amazing? This is one of them. This is Morella. It's an arthropod, but of no known group. Now let's look at the things you can't even place in modern phyla. This animal is called Wewaxia. You can't make much of this jumble. I show you this to give you a sense of the preservation. Here's the reconstruction of Wewaxia. It's a couple centimeters long, an oval-shaped creature covered with these sclerites, these little plates, with 2 rows of spines. One of them is removed here. This is the top view. This is the side view. It crawls forward in this direction. There's a preserved gut. There's a little jaw-like apparatus here. It's not like anything we know. We don't know what it is. It's a representative of a group that didn't make it. Here's a much more bizarre creature called Opabinia. Opabinia has 5 eyes at the base of this frontal nozzle, which extends forward like a vacuum hose, and this bellows-like apparatus behind it, and this little tail fin. No idea what Opabinia was. It does not fit into any modern group. Now here's one with the oddest name of all. This is called Hallucigenia. Simon Conway Morris, who described it, said that it reminded him of something he once saw on a trip, and so he named it that. Hallucigenia has 7 pairs of not arthropod jointed appendages, but struts, fixed struts. The body curves back at one end and forward on another. There's a series of tentacles. This thing is so bizarre. We don't even know what's up or down or backwards and front. This may not even be an organism. It's clearly the part of an organism. But whether it's a whole organism, it may be the part of something even weirder. We just don't know what it is. Yeah. Now here's a reconstruction. Now, I've done a sort of I've shown this slide a lot. Some of you have probably seen it before. But I do a kind of psychological experiment. Whenever I show it, people laugh, and I sort of gauge the laughter a la Arthur Godfrey's little old applause meters. But you see, I think part of the laughter, of course, is that the reconstruction is cartoonish. But I'm sure that a lot of the laughter is a perception of it's the laughter of discomfort. Because these are organisms, but they're so bizarre. You see, we're uncomfortable with them. This is Opabinia with its 5 eyes and this frontal nozzle, poised, ready to catch a hallucigenia, which is going either forwards or backwards into its nozzle. There's a close-up. I got to tell you one more Burgess story before I leave it. Okay? This is really a fantastic story because it illustrates the difference between Walcott's shoehorn and the modern reconstruction. This is an animal that Walcott called Petoia, and he described it as a jellyfish. Looks a little like a jellyfish. Walcott also described a second creature He called it Lagania. He thought it was a sea cucumber. It's a big blob of things. And then there's a third creature, I don't have a slide of it, which is called Anomalocaris, meaning an odd shrimp. Now, Anomalocaris, which looks like a pencil divided into segments, Walcott thought that Anomalocaris was an entire arthropod organism. He thought that this was a sea cucumber, and he thought that Patoia was a jellyfish. It turned out that all three of them go together to form a single animal, which can be called Anomalocaris, which is the weirdest of Burgess creatures, up to a meter long, the largest animal of Cambrian seas. Anomalocaris, it turns out that the jellyfish is the mouth of Anomalocaris. Anomalocaris itself is not a whole arthropod organism, but one of a pair of feeding appendages which could bend around from the front of the head to put food into this circular mouth. This is just the reconstructed head of Anomalocaris. Here's the body from side view and from the top. And again, this is from the bottom with the appendages curving around to put food into this nutcracker circular mouth, the bellows-like apparatus behind. And here's a reconstruction of Anomalocaris, terror of the Cambrian seas. With its bellows, its eyes, its head shield, everting its mouth and bringing a trilobite to its gullet here. Now, the obvious point is, we can have the lights again, there's only one more slide coming in just a minute. The obvious point is that under the Walcott shoehorn, you're in the cone of increasing diversity. There's just a few things in the Burgess. They're simple precursors of what came later. Wind back the tape of life into them, and you get the same story again. But modern life is the preservation of maybe 10% of what was in the Burgess. Now, you might say, oh, well, the ones that didn't make it, Opabinia, Hallucigenia, Anomalocaris, Patalia, a whole bunch of other things, they're really terrible designs. They, okay, it's true. The Burgess Shale was decimated. That's a different model. There's no cone of increasing diversity, but at least it was predictable. I mean, we know that losers lost for cause. Well, that may be true. I can't promise that it isn't. All I can say is that Whittington, Briggs, and Conway Morris, who began with conventional readings of the story, have worked on this stuff for 20 years, and they do not have a vestige or an inkling of an argument which leads them to believe that there is any predictable anatomical inferiority among the losers. As far as they can tell, there is no way to predict the characteristics of those that survived this decimation. And I used to call it a winnowing, but I realize it's the wrong metaphor, because in winnowing you preserve the good guys and throw out the bad ones. No, I think it's a true decimation in the literal sense of that term. You kill at random among the forms that are there, but it's much more than 1 in 10, which is the literal sense of the term. So if you take this interpretation of the Burgess Shale, that the maximal diversity was right at the beginning, that we do not have any indication that winners won for cause, that if you could replay the tape of life and do it again, you would get a completely different set of survivors from this maximal range of Burgess diversity, which would lead life down very different pathways. So that's story 3. Story number 4 is the familiar one. As I said, it can be told in 2 sentences. That is, my hypothetical antagonist says, didn't know about the Burgess. That's a fantastic story. You're right. You decimate the Burgess Shale again, you get a different set of survivors, but once you get the survivors you actually got, then since you admit there's no more creation or destruction of phyla, then surely, now, finally, we've got it. Now we've got predictability. Now we're really going to go fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, human, right? Wrong again. Now we finally do have to think about mass extinctions and some of the capricious elements of patterning that exist even during the last 500 million years. And let's just think about the one familiar story. Namely, is it necessary that mammals would take over from reptiles? Because that doesn't happen. We obviously don't get here. If, as used to be believed by most people, mammals arose very late during the reign of dinosaurs, and then by virtue of warm blood, bigger brains, live birth, and other signs of mammalian superiority drove dinosaurs necessarily to their death, then maybe you'd be justified in thinking that. But I think it's one of the great hidden facts of nobody's trying to hide it, it's just not widely appreciated, that in fact mammals arose at the same time as dinosaurs, virtually. Mammals have not been a successful group for most of their history. 2/3 of the history of mammals is not the story of their success in the so-called age of mammals, but is 100 million years of life as a small group of little creatures, never any bigger than this, living in the nooks and crannies of a world continually dominated, at least for large-bodied creatures, by dinosaurs. Mammals were making no progress whatever towards dispossessing dinosaurs during 2/3 of their history. Mammals got a chance to become large and complex and diverse, eventually giving rise to us and consciousness, because dinosaurs were not moving in that direction, wouldn't have gotten there, only because for some reason dinosaurs became extinct. Now the issue of dinosaur extinction is not resolved, but if Alvarez is even partly right, and a large contribution to that extinction is the ultimate capriciousness of the literal bolt from the blue, the extraterrestrial unpredictable impact, that mammals weather. Why? Not because they're superior, maybe because they're small. Why are they small? Not for any active reason of evolutionary advance, because dinosaurs preempted the possibility of being large before that. No, mass extinction is one of the great devices of putting enormous contingency, even into the later history of life. Rewind the tape of life, no impact at the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, dinosaurs survive. Mammals are still little creatures in the interstices of their world, and we're not here talking about it. So I think the whole history of life is dominated by contingency. After it happens, you can make sense of it. It would never happen the same way again. Now I end with a picture. I pulled a slight pedagogical trick on you. Not really a trick, it's perfectly justifiable. That is, there's one important Burgess organ I didn't tell you about, because I wanted to save it for the end. This is an animal that everybody ought to know about. It's called Pikaia, spelled P-I-K-A-I-A. Now, the reason why you ought to know about it is if anybody asks you that great cosmic question, which obviously science can't totally answer because there are parts of the question of ethical dimensions that science doesn't deal with, namely, why are humans here? Well, there are a lot of answers to that. Some of them come out of the predictable sciences of physics and chemistry, but I tell you, an answer that gives as much of the solution as any single sentence can is the following. We are here because Pikaia survived the decimation of the Burgess Shale fauna. You see, Pikaia is the first chordate. It's the first member of our phylum. It's present in the Burgess Shale as one of the rarest elements. Now, I don't say that Pikaia was the only chordate in the world at that time. We don't know. It's the only one we know about. I doubt that the chordates were really a dominant group destined for necessary success. You play the tape of life again, and this time Pikaia does not make it. And I don't think anybody looking at it at that moment thinks much different. Okay, that's one other funny little worm-like animal that didn't get through. But this one doesn't make it. The vertebrates don't evolve. We're not here. And the Earth is just as well off, except there's no form with consciousness to hear the tale, or to tell the tale, or to explore the tale. See, here's Pikaia with its notochord, with its muscles evolved in the myotomal patterns of chordates. And so, you see, in conclusion, contingency does rule, and I think we do have to say for ourselves, oh, brave and improbable new world that has such people in it. Thank you. Should we ask the commentators if they want to say something first?
Given the size of the crowd, do you want to do
Oh,
that,
sure.
or do you want to hold it till tomorrow?
No,
Let's do it.
Sure, yeah. I think how best to proceed. Obviously, anybody wants to leave can leave. Obviously, who's going to stop you? I think what we'd do first is ask any of the commentators if they want to say something. I should say I was very fortunate that the three people I most wanted to be commentators all agreed to come, and I had definitely ulterior motives. I think I've alluded to them. I asked Tim White to come from Berkeley, who's one of our great experts on human evolution. I think his subject more comes tomorrow. Jim Valentine, one of my invertebrate paleontological colleagues from UC Santa Barbara, who's made a special study of the problem of the origin of animal phyla, and Martin Rudwick, who actually used to be a paleontologist and is an apostate who actually became a historian of science and is, I think, the foremost historian of geology in the world. I asked Martin to come because I think he has a better sense than anyone I know of the nature of history, after all, not only being a historian, but working in that ultimate historical science of geology. And I wonder if any of you three gentlemen wanted to say anything. I'm not putting you on the spot. If you don't want to, you don't have to. There's a seminar at noon tomorrow. Do either of you want to? Any of you want? If not, we'll throw things open to the crowd. Anybody? No? I'll put them on the spot. They're not talking. Okay, that gives you a chance to talk. Anybody got a question? If somebody asks the first one, then there'll be lots of them. It always works that way. Yes?
Why do you assume that any other event would not relate to consciousness?
Well, why do you think it would, considering the great majority of lineages, namely all but one, didn't? Well, I guess mainly because, look, let me make a distinction. I don't know what the full range of forms that consciousness might take could be. I mean, nobody does, obviously. But consciousness in anything like human form, I mean, of the style that we know it, of our form of anatomy, seems so singularly rare in the literal sense that look how many lineages there are, only one of which and very recently has gotten there. And for that lineage, there are so many wonderfully quirky events that could have wiped it out so many times. We're so lucky that it didn't happen. I mean, one little change in African environments a few million years ago could have wiped it out, and back and back and back. If there hadn't been a lineage of fishes that had fins arranged in an odd way that they could walk on land, because you can't do that with most fish fins, you never would have had land-dwelling vertebrates. And there are just so many stages that could have wiped out that lineage that I think the probabilities are just tiny. But one thing I don't think one can make a statement about is obviously conceivable that intelligence, or what we want to call intelligence in some other form, very unlike human anatomy, I don't know how one begins to calculate anything off that. Yes?
You use the image repeatedly of replaying the tape of life. And I was wondering if you're using that image deliberately.
Well, I guess so. Because what?
The implications for that image are very important for what you're saying, because if it's a tape, somehow it has a beginning and an end that are already somehow recorded, or you can look at it like a book.
Oh, no, the tape, look, I mean, obviously it's a metaphor, and one doesn't want to push the literal characteristics of metaphors too far, but obviously what I'm doing in this metaphor, the tape itself merely represents the linear chronology of time, and I'm very carefully erasing it and making it absolutely blank when I wind it back, and then I'm just letting it run again.
You're assuming a linear line of time.
Well, I think time moves forward in a linear fashion. I know there are philosophical issues, and the Kant had things to say about that. I'm putting those aside, true Philistine that I am, and I will take it that time moves forward. Yeah. In some sensible way, yeah. Yeah, there's lots of evidence that it didn't happen. I mean, I think it would have been really bizarre if dinosaurs had evolved anything that we would be willing to call consciousness in human terms and didn't leave any artifact of it, when you consider the density of artifact that one species has left on the surface of this earth in the few thousand years we've had that attribute. I mean, we know a fair amount about dinosaurs, and even fooled us that badly. Yeah. Yeah, you, right there. Well, I'd use this one because that's the job of, I mean, I think they're right. I wasn't being critical. But if I were concerned with truth, which is not what a advertising iconographer is concerned with, I guess I'd try and develop something like the proper representation of the Burgess Shale, namely an enormous splay and then a few odd lineages going up. I don't know what its sales benefits would be, but maybe we could think of that. Out of respect to people who ask them, I can't. I'd rather ask people who ask the questions to shout them a little louder so people can hear them. I don't think speakers can adequately give accounts of what people want to ask. But please, even face the audience if you will, and shout at the top of your lungs.
Doesn't the vast number of places in the universe, the history of life being worked out on reintroduced necessity?
I don't know. I mean, who can make the calculation? I mean, we really don't know that. There's something in the literature that is called, in textbooks, the Drake equation, which is really silly because it's not an equation at all. It's just a verbal argument that's placed in quasi-mathematical terms. That's no criticism. I don't think Frank Drake meant any more for it. The point is you can't calculate the separate. Yeah, it's true. That's how you would go about it. If you knew how many worlds there were that had Earth-like planets, and if you actually knew the probability. But all you could get out of that would be the probability of something like DNA arising. Then you have these probably incalculable contingencies of various directions. No, of course, as a generality, what you say must be so. The higher percentage of worlds that have Earth-like planets, the greater the chance of something like it. But we have no basis to really give a proper number for what that might be. Obviously, I hope that it's so, and I'm a great supporter. Not because I think the chances are high, but because the rewards would be so great if it was successful. That I'm a great supporter of exobiological efforts because I think it's worth the chance. But I don't know how to calculate it. Nobody does. Yeah.
Can you compare the richness arising from cultural and biological contingencies? Cultural evolution as opposed to biological evolution?
What do you mean by richness? I mean, you mean is one richer than the other? Is one less probable than? I don't know. They're not really comparable because cultural evolution is all within the confines of a single species with limited but unprecedented biological repertoire. Cultural evolution has many other features which I think entail greater predictability, the main one being its Lamarckian style of inheritance. I mean, there is a rationale for a kind of progressivism in cultural evolution that you just don't have in biological evolution. I can tell that was somebody hissing or a drain pipe. I think it was the latter. But because in the Lamarckian style of cultural evolution, what you learn in one generation is directly passed to the next and can be built upon. So there is a progressive character to at least certain technological trends in human cultural history. On the other hand, when you look at the vast variety of what people do, I find most comparisons between cultural and biological evolution, most analogies, more misleading than useful, though I don't doubt there are legitimate analogies to be drawn. Yeah. Gotta talk louder, I can't hear you. It doesn't, the question is whether mass extinction contradicts natural selection. There's really two ways to get at that question. Of course, in the broader sense, it doesn't, because the principle of natural selection is this theory about how organisms adapt to changing environments. There's nothing in the theory that says that if the environmental change is so quick and so profound that organisms can't adapt fast enough that they die. I mean, that's consistent with Darwin's principle. However, it's not that simple. I mean, you can't just say, therefore, Darwin's fine, because that's what he said. If the change is big enough, they all die. And because Darwin, in fact, I'll read you a quotation, because I just happen to have it here, from Darwin. Because Darwin had a notion of progress that was very different from our current convictions about contingency, because Darwin didn't see it that way. Darwin acknowledged that mass extinction was a possibility. He tried very hard to explain away mass extinctions as artifacts of an imperfect record. He didn't like it, even though there's nothing that confutes his theory in them. To Darwin, Darwin had a controlling metaphor, the metaphor of the wedge, under which nature is full all the time, and new species, in order to get into the economy of nature, his phrase, can only do so by wedging another one out. He says nature's like a log, like a surface, he says, covered with 10,000 wedges. And if a new species wants to get in, it has to bang itself in and drive another one out. Therefore, the history of life is mediated by competition. If the history of life is mediated by overt competition among organisms, then organisms that get in can only do so by driving another out. If the only way to get in is by driving another out, you do so by virtue of your superiority to that creature, and there's a kind of aggregate march to complexity through time. So you get in Darwin statements like this: the inhabitants of each successive period in the world's history have beaten their predecessors in the race for life, and are insofar higher in the scale of nature. And this may account for that vague yet ill-defined sentiment felt by many paleontologists that organization on the whole has progressed. So that's a typical Darwinian statement. So I think this world of mass extinction, though it's not non-Darwinian, it doesn't contradict the abstract character of the theory of natural selection. It's very different from Darwin's own expectation, rooted in part in the biases of how, despite the massive contingency that you get in life, there is still, through the notion that the history of life is ruled by competitive wedging, a kind of aggregation and complexity, whereas mass extinction removes a lot of that rationale. It shows that a lot of life's patterning is not by this slow and steady wedging, but is the capricious removal of some things, like dinosaurs creating opportunities unsuspected for other things that weren't doing very well, namely mammals, for a long time. First of all, I'd have to sort of start right at the beginning and ask what consciousness is. It's a good vernacular term. We all have our private definitions. I'm not a computer buff. I don't even write on a word processor. I have very little sense of capacity of machines. I suppose that issue largely reduces to the question of whether a lot of what we call consciousness is the quantitative addition of circuitry. And maybe it is. I don't know. I'm sorry, I have to bypass that because it's just not an area I know a lot about. Yeah. Oh, I would say it was pretty good. I mean, the Burgess there is it's a lot of animals. Oh, well, I didn't tell you that. No, it doesn't, in fact. I mean, I told you the story of the Burgess Shale. There's a fauna in China, which is actually probably 10 or so million years younger, which seems to have very much the same fauna in it. It's like the Ediacara fauna. It has a type locality. The only ones I talked about were the Burgess Pit, but we pretty well know it's a worldwide fauna. Yeah. No, I think there's enough evidence that, yeah, if it was only that pit, I'm sorry, it's just, I really didn't have time to, even if I'd given a whole lecture on the Burgess, I did go through it too quickly, and your question's a good one. It's like Ediacara, it's not just a place in Australia. First of all, some of the organisms have fossilizable parts, like the claw of Anomalocaris does have hard material and is fossilizable. The spicules of Wiwaxia, that first thing I showed, are preservable, and those are known throughout the world. So we know that those elements that do preserve in ordinary faunas are worldwide. Secondly, there are now in various places in the world Burgess elements found in other places. There's a fauna in China, as I just started to say. It's probably just as rich as the Burgess. Only a few papers have come out, but I've seen some of the specimens. There's a fauna in Utah and Nevada, which has many Burgess elements. There's a borehole in Poland, which has Anomalocaris. So we're beginning to get cascading evidence of the worldwide character. There's a fauna up in Greenland, in eastern Greenland, of consistent age that has Burgess elements. So yeah, I think it's a worldwide fauna. I think we know that. Yeah. Again, I just know so little about chaos theory, and what little I've read intrigues me, but I don't feel well enough versed to answer that. Yeah. I think what does convergence really do? Whoops. Sorry. What does convergence really do for you? Convergence is the phenomenon of high degrees of similarity in high degrees of similarity in unrelated lineages, like the ichthyosaur, which is remarkably fish-like in considerable detail. Convergence tells, first of all, the closest convergences are in forms that are really not that far apart. I mean, you don't get anything as fish-like as an ichthyosaur in a mollusk. I mean, squids, are vertebrate-like, but not near so vertebrate-like. You can only get these extreme degrees of convergence when you have a basic ground plan of inheritance that by homology, by contingency, is fixed and set to begin with. Otherwise, the great convergences that you have that are really between distant phyla are usually of the external forms of organisms. Some of them are very impressive. I mean, Martin here once wrote about a brachiopod called Prorictophenia, which is so coral-like, it's quite astounding in external form. You start looking at it in detail, it's a brachiopod. So I think convergence in many ways is overrated. I think one of the reasons, I don't mean to undermine, I think it's a very important phenomenon. I think one of the reasons it's overrated is that we have too deterministic a view of evolution. Everybody thinks, for example, because there's that famous page in all textbooks, that Australia is nothing more than a continent of convergent forms upon placental mammals. And it's true, there are some remarkable convergences. Remember, they're both mammals. There's a marsupial mole that really does look like a mole. But when I went to Australia, I never realized, I was stunned by how many simply odd things there are in Australia. I mean, the whole group of kangaroos has nothing to do with any other mammal. The whole group of what they call possums down there, and the wallaby group, these other kangaroos, the so-called Tasmanian devil is unlike any placental carnivore. I think the convergences are much overrated, even for some of the standard examples. Yeah. Land, well, I don't, that's a very, obviously there is a domain of broad predictability. I don't deny that. I mean, I'd be willing to go so far as bilateral symmetry, for example. And I might be willing, if I were an intelligent creature in the sea 500 million years ago, to say, there's this big domain up there, probably someday someone will figure out how to exploit it. But you see, we're interested in detail, though. Consciousness is a detail. It's not the end result of a long, predictable sequence. I'll get into that issue more tomorrow, the realm of detail versus the realm of predictability. Yeah. I don't, if it modified it at all, I think what humans are doing is probably more unpredictably capricious than anything that's happened before. I mean, in a couple thousand years, one species, through an odd invention, has modified the surface of this planet like no other species has. Again, you replay your tape 100 million years ago, would you have ever thought that you would get a species that would so disrupt the entire history of the planet, maybe even ending large segments of life through its own interventions? I mean, that's never happened before. So if anything, I think the quirks of human history have only accentuated the unpredictabilities. I think the boss here wants me to stop, so I'm going to stop. Is that right? No, well, he doesn't. He wants to say something, so we'll let him say something.
In view of, to employ a metaphor popular on this campus at the moment, this is only the first game. There is a second tomorrow evening. We want to make sure that all the players are fresh for it. So I think we've had perhaps enough this evening. Let me remind you that Professor Gould's second lecture, The Quest for Human Nature, Fortuitous Side Consequences and Contingent History, will be here tomorrow night at the same hour. Professors White and Rudwick and Valentine, who will be around tomorrow as well and who have our gratitude for their participation in this program, will also be joining in a seminar tomorrow noon, which can't quite accommodate all the members of this audience, but which nevertheless will interest some of you. Let me conclude by thanking the Ethics and Society program and the Philosophy Department for their sponsorship, and let me ask you to join me in thanking Professor Gould once again for a remarkable evening.
Stanford Centennial. Oh, man, I will give it to you. A little long, but all my best.
Oh. My name is John Dupre, and I'm a member of the Philosophy Department and the Ethics and Society program, joint local sponsors of the Tanner Lectures in Human Values. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our 13th Tanner lecturer, Stephen J. Gould, who will tonight give his second and final Tanner lecture. Stephen J. Gould is Professor of Geology and Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology at Harvard University. In his introduction last night, President Kennedy provided us with a sample of Professor Gould's extraordinary and wide-ranging professional achievements. Rather than add to that list, though it would be easy to do so, let me briefly mention a rather different kind of reason why Professor Gould is such a peculiarly appropriate person to be giving these particular lectures. Perhaps no eminent contemporary scientist reveals so clearly in his work the awareness that science matters, not just to the community of science, but to society at large. First, if science is to be, in a phrase dating from the origins of modern science, for the people must have some idea what science says. Probably everyone in this audience has encountered and enjoyed some of Gould's contributions to this project. I know of no other living scientist with the same combination of professional authority and literary skill. Perhaps the size of this audience is the best testimony to his achievements as a scientific communicator. More relevant, though, even than Gould's ability to inform and educate a wide audience, is the content of what he has communicated. Science provides knowledge, and knowledge, as we all know, gives power. Thus, science is not only embedded in society, but also cannot help but provide a basic political constituent of society. Awareness of this aspect of science and its concomitant responsibilities is everywhere in Gould's work, and a considerable part of his work is directly responsive to this political dimension of science. I think most especially, though by no means exclusively, of his brilliant book, The Mismeasure of Man, which dissects the history of scientific racism and the abuses of hereditarian theories of intelligence. Though it would be easy and a pleasure to speak about other of our speakers' many accomplishments, I shall not indulge myself. I have no doubt that those who heard or heard about Professor Gould's talk yesterday are impatient for more and will want only one thing from me, that I say no more and make way for the main event. Without more ado then, it is my great pleasure to introduce for his second Tanner lecture in Human Values, Professor Stephen J. Gould.
From the very earliest records of modern cognition, for some reasons that I don't fully understand, human beings have sought to grasp the essence, the abstraction, the deep meaning of our species, you can start with the very first representations of art, the Venus figures of Willendorf and others, which clearly are abstractions of feminine form and not attempts at representational depiction. Goes back to the deeper reality that supposedly exists behind the shadows on Plato's cave, where the shadows, of course, are our overt world, on to the unintentionally cruel medieval experiments in which to learn the original tongue of the essence of humanity. On an occasion or two, children were raised without any contact with any human speech in order to see what the original language was. Would they speak Hebrew? Would they speak whatever God said to people? And of course they said nothing. We have many versions of how to seek essence, whatever that means. There are religious approaches. In at least one of our traditions, creation of our form is said to be in the image of God, and that gives us, therefore, perhaps our only direct insight into God's nature if we can understand ourselves. But of course what I want to talk about here is the scientist's version, or some of the scientific versions, that we learn the essence of human beings by analysis, by our style of thought, whether it be IQ theory, under the older hereditarian notion that there is a single thing inside the head, a unitary intelligence that could even be quantified and ranked, to the factor analytic theory of G, or general intelligence, which is part of the justificatory apparatus of that form of IQ theory. But that's not what I'm going to talk about here. I want to talk about the evolutionary version. That's what's going to concern me tonight, particularly the hardline take on Darwin's notion from the strict form of natural selection, namely that if you're going to have any meaningful notion of the deepest essence of human beings, that what you have to understand is how natural selection has built us, because natural selection is the primary, if not virtually the only, cause of evolutionary change. Now, of course, immediately you have a problem, particularly in the light of the biases as I discussed them last night. The theory of natural selection as an abstract proposition is not a theory that will give us any of the favorable features of the deepest part of human nature that the biases impose upon us. It will not let us see human nature as the highest and most complex form of cognition or animal life, because natural selection in the abstract is a theory of local adaptation. That's all it is. It's not a theory of general progress. It says that when environments change, organisms adapt to become better suited to those local environments. That might be complexification of design, but it might be profound simplification in environments suited to parasites, for example. And Darwin was very clear on that as a distinctive feature of his evolutionary theory, that it did not include an intrinsic principle of absolutely necessary progress. He had a correspondence with a great American paleontologist, Alpheus Hyatt, whose office I happen to inhabit now. And after several letters, Darwin writes, "After long reflection, I cannot avoid the conclusion that no inherent tendency to progressive development exists." So if you're going to take natural selection theory and you want a notion of essence that matches the biases, that sees the evolution of human beings as something predictable, progressive, in the highest form of the expression of animal life, how do you get it? And that was a real problem for Darwin, because on the one hand he did have the radical interpretation of evolutionary causality built into the abstractions of natural selection. On the other hand, he was not willing to let go. As a Victorian, an eminent Victorian, he was not willing to let go of progress as a concept. And I challenge anyone to give a coherent exegesis of Darwin's view on the issue. You get books on both sides. You usually get books on both sides that both positions are there. Great thinkers do not reach consistency on every possible issue, because if anything, because they're so honest with themselves. I mean, Progress was an issue that Darwin never resolved. It pulled him both ways. There was the argument from the abstraction of the theory of natural selection, which said it's a theory of local adaptation, but Darwin was not willing to read progress out. Now, I tried to deal with that issue in the question session last night, but I want to reiterate that. Darwin's final resolution, insofar as he could bring these disparate parts of his thought together, was to argue that yes, indeed, the abstract character of natural selection gives no rationale for progress, but if I import to the workings of natural selection a set of statements about how ecology works and how organisms fit into environments, progress will tumble out of that as an adjunct. And the basic argument under the primary metaphor of Darwin's whole vision, the metaphor of the wedge, the metaphor he first used when he first took a pen in hand after he got the Malthusian insight in 1838, namely that nature is full of species, at all times about as full as it can be. Nature, he says, is like a surface covered with 10,000 wedges, representing addresses where organisms or species can live. And if any new form is going to get in to the economy of nature, his phrase, it can only do so by forcing itself into a little chink between two of the wedges and wedging or driving another species out. And because nature is full and evolution proceeds not by capricious removals and mass extinction, as I tried to defend last night, but through the accumulation of competitive interactions under the metaphor of the wedge, there will therefore be, though the abstractions of natural selection don't provide it, a kind of predictable progress that comes through replacement in the fossil record being a result of the victory of the more successful in overt competition with the less successful. Let me just read you two quotations from Darwin, because that notion of the perfection and the honing of the wedge is there anybody who can turn off that telephone that's trying to get someone on the phone? Because I find it disturbing. I don't know whether you do this. Somewhere a telephone, which no one's answering. And if someone would take it off the hook, that'd be terrific. Here's the statement I read in response to the question last night. I'll just give it to you again. This is Darwin's rationale based on the metaphor of the wedge. He says, the inhabitants of each successive period in the world's history have beaten their predecessors in the race for life and are insofar higher in the scale of nature. And this may account for that vague yet ill-defined sentiment felt by many paleontologists that organization on the whole has progressed. So there's the rationale. Now, at the very end of The Origin of Species, in the famous concluding passages, Darwin puts it much more strongly on the line, and he says, very simply, as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection. Now, that's the hardest line statement that you can find in Darwin, and it is in the context of that tradition of studying human essences that I speak tonight. Now, while Darwin, using the metaphor of the wedge, can give us that version of human perfectibility, at the same time, the main thrust of evolutionary theory is also pulling us the other way, away from notions that there's any meaning to a concept of an essential nature or human nature. After all, evolutionary scholars like Ernst Mayr will tell us that the main philosophical thrust of evolutionary theory is to destroy once and forever that oldest Western Platonic tradition of essentialism and to teach us that there is no meaningful essential form, that variation is all there is, that the reality of a species is its variation spectrum, not any abstract notion of central tendency that we call a mean or a mode or an essence even, that all there is the variation. That's what evolution has taught us. There are no essences, only variation. So these pull against each other. Now I finally reach the theme sentence of tonight's talk, which is a conundrum. It's a kind of catch-22. It's a paradox, if you will, because what I want to do is to defend the idea that there can be a meaningful concept of essence coming from evolutionary theory. And I'm especially sheepish. I'm not a sheepish person, as I'm sure you infer, especially having been invited by a philosophy department. Look, I know that there's 2,000 years of philosophical tradition and a lot of very sophisticated analysis about concepts and words, such as essence, I'm making a coarse appeal to a kind of vernacular sense. Maybe you oughtn't to use the word essence. What I mean really are distinctive universal properties that arise from our biological and evolutionary construction. Give me another word. I'm not attached to essence, as long as you know what I mean. Distinctive universal properties of human beings that arise by virtue of the way we're built evolutionarily. I want to defend the idea that there's a meaningful notion of that. But, and here's the paradoxical part of the catch-22 part, it's not what you think. It is, when that claim is made, it's usually in the defense of some predictable kind or set of attributes built by natural selection in this highest of all creatures, so that those behaviors that we might consider essential and universal are the fundamental properties that, by participating in the Darwinian struggle for reproductive success, have made us what we are and continue to define us. And in that sense, they come right out of natural selection theory itself and are truly essential to our origin and the maintenance of whatever it is that we call human. And I wanted to find that there are such properties that we can call distinctive universals of our evolutionary construction, but they arise in very different ways that have to do with quirks and contingencies. And some of you will be very disappointed by that, I suppose, but the whole essence, another vernacular sense, of both these lectures is that you really oughtn't to be disappointed by such a conclusion, because claims that certain properties, be they human universals or outcomes, like what happened to life after the Burgess Shale, if they result not from subsumption under the laws of nature but a happenstances of history, that's just as explainable and twice as interesting. Well, at least as interesting. You don't have to think it's twice as interesting, but as long as you're willing to entertain the notion it's just as interesting as what's subsumable right under the laws of nature, I'm happy. Now, what I want to do is to base my argument about these distinctive universals of evolutionary construction on two claims which represent, I think, exciting developments within the evolutionary sciences. They represent new material that have fueled debates over the last 10 or 15 years within my profession. The first, and the rest of the talk neatly divides in two halves. The first is based on critiques of the concept of adaptation within evolutionary theory, so it's a take on evolutionary theory itself. The second is based on discoveries about the recent history of our own lineage. And that's this rather peculiar title I gave, Fortuitous Side Consequences and Contingencies of History. I want to argue that these essences, distinctive universals of evolutionary construction, exist, but they're not the predictable makers of human nature under Darwinian imperatives of reproductive success, that the most important ones probably emerge either as fortuitous side consequences, and that's going to be the critique of adaptationist theory within biology, or they arise as contingencies of history, and that'll be the second theme of what we've recently learned about the history of our own species in the last couple 100,000 years. And critique of evolutionary theory, I'm going to argue, is the first part of the talk, that characters that represent these distinctive universals are not always, even often, or even most importantly, products of honing natural selection produced by progress under the metaphor of the wedge, but they're just as likely to be, and probably more often are, I will even make the strong claim that they more often are in some quantitative sense, odd and quirky side consequences of changes that have arisen for other reasons, or even more disturbing to traditional views, for no reasons expressed in adaptational terms. You'll see what I mean in a moment. And secondly, the issue of contingencies of history, that historical vestiges, is that phone again? It's got to be here somewhere. That historical vestiges of a much more, pardon me, I didn't say that right, that there are these distinctive universal traits which are not deep essences of the soul or products of honing natural selection, but are just historical vestiges held by all of us historically as a result of the fact that we all, in our racial diversity, are products of a much more recent common ancestry than we ever dared to dream a few years ago, and therefore it becomes quite intelligible that even those characters that we've treated as universal in that deep sense of necessarily evolved for the structure of our intellect are in fact merely remnants of whatever those common ancestors 100,000 years ago or so happened to do by historical contingency. They're not predictable from the laws of nature. They're merely the historical state of our contingent and circumstantial ancestry, some of which is preserved because there hasn't been enough time to get rid of it all, as we used to think. So let me go back to the first part, though, the notion that characters of the essence are not products of natural selection working by the wedge, but are likely to be odd and quirky side consequences of changes that arise for other reasons or no reasons. I want to talk about what I like to call the principle of spandrels. Now, some of you may have heard me discuss this before and even show the same slides before in other contexts, and I'm sorry for you folks because the next 20 minutes might be dull, but I make this appeal to you that I finally figured out where it goes. This is the right place for this theme, I'm now convinced. Now, yesterday I made the point, I tried to argue that instead of our canonical textbook examples of the greatest manifestation of ordinary evolution, I pointed out that you almost always get examples of optimal morphology constructed by natural selection. You get the perfect butterfly mimic, you get the walking stick insect, you get the ichthyosaur, it looks like a fish. And I showed you that picture of a bird, remember? The African heron, an African heron, that uses its wings primarily to shade the water to see its prey, and pointed out that that ought to be the exemplification of evolution, that better caught the essence of what evolution is about than our usual examples of optimizing selection, which do exist. I don't deny that they exist, because the bird wing slide embodies this principle of quirky and unpredictable functional shift, because the distant ancestor of the heron evolves the wing under the you can't fly with 10% of a wing, incipient stages of useful structures problem, evolves the wing first for something other than flight, perhaps thermoregulation in the usual view. The wing is then co-opted for flight. The heron's ancestor flies with it for 120 million years or whatever, and then a little while ago it's co-opted again through the second double quirky functional shift for mantling behavior. So that even though the design's good, works real well to mantle the water, the current utility of it teaches you nothing about this extremely unpredictable, quirky character of its history. And that's very likely to apply to characters of human behavior that we consider those distinctive universals, as we may hold behavioral characteristics that work really well to do something that's important for us now. We mustn't make the mistake, and this is an important part of the first thing I'm trying to say, we must not make the mistake of assuming, therefore, that that's why they evolved, that we now know the historical basis of their origin, that we now know their contribution to the fashioning of human essences, that we now know the regime of natural selection under which human beings were built in their distinctive ways. That's not likely to be so, because evolution is ruled by the origin of structures in one sense that are later co-opted for other functions. And that's a very important principle, not only in evolution, but also in human culture, as I'll show in a moment. Look, primate brains were larger than those of other mammals right from the beginning. I don't think anyone could argue that 60 million years ago that was so, because somehow those prototypical primates knew that long down the line they would be the ancestral line of those that finally developed our powers of abstraction. It may have had more to do with the difficulties of living in a three-dimensional world up in the trees, because most creatures in three-dimensional worlds do have relatively larger brains than relatives living in a more planar ecology. I don't know the reason, but it's quite likely that even that basic feature of being in a group with big brains first arises, that is, the big brains themselves arise for other reasons, and luckily that's available for co-optation for human consciousness. Note, this principle of quirky functional shift is enormously important. Now let me show you a series of slides that will set the context for the even more contradictory claim I want to make, showing indeed that this principle of functional shift works in human terms as well. Let's look at the first set of pictures. I took all these in Nairobi a couple of years ago. It's a phenomenon that we hardly see in our culture, where you don't fix anything anymore because it's more expensive to fix a watch than to buy a new one, unless you're wearing Richard's Rolex. But of course, in the third world, everything is fixed and recycled and used again. And if you go to the Nairobi recycling market, you really begin to get some insight into how it is that you cannot infer from a trait or a feature that seems to be well designed for what it's doing very much about its historical construction. Do you know what happens to most, or to, at least to some automobile tires throughout the third world? Well, they're made into sandals. I'm sure many of you have seen these. This is the area in Nairobi where the old tires are cut down into sandals. This is the very same scene in a small town in India. You can see the pairs of sandals for sale having been carved out of. Now, if you look at those sandals, they're very strong and they wear well, but you would never say that now I know the adaptive significance of tires. It's just not right. It's a quirky functional shift. And if much of human behavior, even human behavior that works and is sensibly interpreted as distinctive universal, arose by co-optation, well, you may know what it's doing now, but you don't understand a whole lot about its historical role in our construction. Here's the production of kerosene lamps from tin cans cut in half, the production of traveling trunks from bits and scraps of metal, and in my favorite example, you know what happens to oil drums after they're empty? Well, the tops are taken off and pounded out by the metal workers to form large cooking bowls. Again, you do not know the adaptive significance of oil drums when you see these by any means. Now I'll call that the principle of the Nairobi recycling market, if you will, the principle of quirky functional shift. But this isn't enough. This is not the radical claim that I want to make about distinctive human universals, because although there is quirky functional shift, although you cannot use current utility to infer historical origin, and therefore cannot know from current utility how this trait in its current sense was involved in the construction of human nature, at least there are adaptations down the line. The automobile tire works well in its original functions, co-optable for something else, but there are adaptations all the way. The bird's wing works when it's for thermoregulation, it works when it's for flight, it works when it's for manling. You do have unpredictable contingencies, quirky functional shifts, but at least you have construction in each cycle by a principle of utility and adaptation, so that you are not departing from the idea that there's a sensible interpretation of distinctive universals in terms of utility. You just have to deal with the fact that you may not be able to use current utility to figure out what it was originally for. That then brings up the principle of spandrels, because I'd like to argue that is, the Nairobi recycling market principle doesn't go nearly far enough in talking about the side consequence issue. Yes, it's true, being a sandal is a side consequence of the state of rubber made for automobile tires, but there's still adaptive continuity, even though there's change of function. I'd like to argue that so much of what the brain does that is distinctive of the universal is very likely to be not only a side consequence, but a secondary utility that arises from a primary construction that never was an adaptation. It wasn't an adaptation at its origin. It began as an architectural byproduct, later co-opted for utility in some sense. And that's a profoundly different kind of, you don't even have a sensible story in terms of utility for historical origin. And if many of the distinctive universals of human cognition do in fact arise that way, as architectural byproducts that were never adaptations at their origin, even though they may later be co-opted in some sense for utility, then I think, although we may have universal behaviors, they certainly have a different constitution from the Darwinian interpretation of the metaphor of the wedge and the honing for perfection. Now, why do I call this the principle of spandrels, which is obviously an architectural term? And the best way I can do this is by giving the architectural example that I worked out in a paper with Dick Lewontin in 1979. And it wasn't flip, I think, to choose this example. I chose it in part out of personal ontogeny. I really did get this idea when I was standing under the central dome at the Cathedral of San Marco in Venice, but also because it's a principle that's very difficult to understand for organisms. Our training so leads us to interpret structures that work on organisms as having been designed by natural selection for their utilities, or if we understand the Nairobi principle, for other utilities and then co-opted, that we just find it very difficult even to think about structures that do not arise at all in the context of adaptation, whatever their later co-optation for utility. And to use an example from architecture where there isn't the baggage of a century of Darwinian interpretation, where the principle comes clear, I think is useful. So let me tell you my story of the spandrels of San Marco. If you mount a dome, circular dome, on 4 rounded arches meeting at right angles, you have to have, at the corners, where any 2 arches meet, a tapering triangular space. You just have to. I mean, you got this radially symmetrical dome, you're mounting it on 4 arches meeting at right angles, the arches are rounded. Wherever 2 arches meet, you're going to have these tapering triangular spaces. Now, such spaces left over, so to speak, in between structural elements are called spandrels. That's the general architectural term. These particular kinds of spandrels are called pendentas, but I'll use the general term. So inevitably, if you decide to mount a dome on 4 arches, rounded, meeting at right angles, you're going to have 4 pendentas, 4 triangular shaped spandrels. You have to. Go into your chapel here, right across from Jordan Hall, and you'll see 4 beautiful pendentas, angels with wings beautifully filling those spandrels. Now, since the spaces are, you can't call these spaces adaptations. The spandrels are not adaptations. If there's an analog to adaptation here, I believe there is, it's the architectural decision to mount the dome on the 4 arches. That works. We know the principles. That's the analog of adaptation. Once you've made that decision, 4 triangular spaces is an architectural byproduct. It's not in any sense an adaptation, unless you want to argue that they had such a good design in mind for 4 triangular spandrels that that's why they decided to build a building that way. That is not logically impossible. It's not very likely. I think your laughter leads me to think you share that impression. We know it's not true in San Marco, where the designs and the spandrels were not made for a century or so until after the thing was put up. So it's a good example on that account. Now, and since the design in San Marco is rich mosaic throughout, you might as well put something that's iconographically proper, aesthetically satisfying, and fitting to the space, and that's what they've done. Here's one of the domes of San Marco, and we have in the 4 spandrels representations of the 4 evangelists and their conventional animal symbols. Here's Matthew the man, here's Mark the lion, the symbol of the city of Venice. Here's the ox, Luke, and John the eagle. And they are depicted in their angelic form with wings that beautifully fill the spandrels. Just as I urge you tomorrow, if you've probably never been in there in all your years at Stanford, go into the chapel and take a look at the angels and the spandrels, and you'll see the point. Now, you could say, well, isn't that something? There are 4 evangelists, and there are 4 spandrels, and they fit so well. Now I know why the spandrels are there. But you would never argue that. You'd know that you can't argue that the spandrels exist to house the evangelists. The spandrels are there as architectural byproducts. They happen to be suited to this iconography, among others, and the mosaicist has decided to put them there. That's the only sensible interpretation you can give. They're not adaptations. They're co-opted later because they're there and you might as well use them, and that's all you can say. Here's, sorry, I put that in backwards, but as I had the last one too. This is Luke and one of the spandrels, the ox. Now, that was not the dome that first gave me this idea. This is the one, the more complicated central dome, the great central dome of the Cathedral of San Marco, St. Mark's Cathedral, in Venice. Again, oh, thanks. Yeah, the darker you can make, these slides are actually art. You know, most of my others are just, but these are worth looking at. If I can focus them. Yeah. Here again we have, and these is a beautiful and more complex design. Again we have evangelists in the spandrels, in the tops of the spandrels, depicted this time in human form, sitting at their writing desks with the beginning lines of their gospel in each case. And below, in the tapering part of the triangle, underneath each evangelist, we see a personification of one of the four biblical rivers, the Tigris, the Nile, the Indus, the Nile, the Euphrates, and the Tigris, depicted as a man holding an amphora, a water cask above his head, pouring water down into the very narrow space, watering a single flower from below. It's just a beautiful fit of an iconographically sensible design into this pre-existing space. But you cannot argue that the spandrels exist to house the evangelists again. And no one would. You see that immediately for architecture, but not for organisms. So here is, for example, St. Mark himself, seated in the top of one of these spandrels. Everything makes sense, it's beautiful. There's a Latin inscription that, here's St. Matthew, there's a Latin inscription that runs along the top. It says, Sic actus Christi. It says, here's St. John, Describunt quatuor isti. Thus did these four describe the acts of Christ. And below them, here's the personification of the river Tigris as a man holding the amphora. And if you could see the rest of it, the water coming down and watering a single flower. It's a beautiful design. Now, at this point of the argument, you could say, and this is the standard argument of those who wish to support the strongest version of Darwinian progress under the metaphor of the wedge. Yes, of course you're right. I understand that example. That's true. The spandrels are architectural byproducts. They are not adaptations. Yes, if there's good design in them now, it's secondary co-optation for utility. So if there's good design and that's a universal property, that's not why it's there. It never was an adaptation to begin with. It's much more quirky, accidental, circumstantial. But it's not an important principle because spandrels are only nooks and crannies left over. That's all they are. They're just little bits. Yes, you're right, but they're tiny little nooks and crannies of a larger structure whose main theme is adaptation. And someone who's more sophisticated in the history of art once pointed out to me that, in fact, since it was so well recognized that spandrels are constrained little spaces, that it's traditional to pay people less, and that Michelangelo had in fact originally refused to paint the spandrels of the Sistine Chapel. Eventually he relented, thank goodness, because he painted those beautiful Sibyls and prophets in the spandrels of the Sistine Chapel. And so therefore that's the critique. Now the reason why I chose this example is that it is not only a good illustration of the principle of spandrels itself, but it also confutes the primary critique, namely that the phenomenon's true, but its relative frequency is insignificant because they're funny little nooks and crannies, bits and pieces left over. Because that's not necessarily true. Yes, in a sense, the spandrel is minor compared to the architectural decision, but the spandrel can then itself influence the building or the rest of the design in return. And so what appears to be a nook and a cranny can, in its own cascading implications, actually end up potentially being more important than the original adaptation that spawned the whole design to begin with. And that's what I want to argue for the brain. That's where I'm going. But it works certainly in the case of the spandrels of San Marco, because remember, the dome above the spandrels is radially symmetrical. There is nothing about the intrinsic geometry of that dome that suggests quadripartite or fourfold division, right? It's radially symmetric. You make 7-part division, 22-part division, whatever you want. There's nothing intrinsically about the dome suggesting it. On the other, however, every dome but one in San Marco has in its design a fundamental fourfold division that is clearly responsive to the existence of the designs in the spandrels below. So that the spandrels, even if they are bits and pieces, end up in major ways determining the entire artistic program of the dome, even though there's nothing about the dome that implies that. So that there is feedback from the nooks and crannies enhancing the importance. So, for example, here's the figure in the central dome. There is a bilateral axis set by Jesus and Mary here, but everything else is in 4, and so we see the 4 winds around the figure of Jesus, and everything else goes out in 4. Here are a couple other examples. Here's another one of the domes of San Marco, and we have angels in the spandrels again, and 12 apostles, I think, in the dome, clearly in groups of 3 centered on the spandrels, in 4 groups of 3. Again, there's nothing about the intrinsic property of the dome that specifies that's a response to the spandrels. And finally, an even clearer example, here's, if I can focus it. Here we have 4 female saints in the spandrels, 4 male saints in the dome, and obviously an alternating arrangement. And now we can have the lights, please. Now, I think that's easy enough to understand as an architectural example. What does it have to do with the evolution of the brain? I think it has everything to do with the evolution of the brain. Start thinking about it. How does the brain get big? I don't want to be too crude. I don't think big brain is all that's involved in whatever we do that's distinctive, but let me at least be crude enough to think that it has something to do with our peculiar abilities. I'm willing to take a very conventional view about why the brain got big. I'm not sure I really believe it, but let me take it just because the spandrels argument will work. Even with I will take the most conventional possible Darwinian view about why the brain got big. The brain got big because natural selection favored certain distinctive, important, and maybe quite complex behaviors that made us what we are and for which a large brain was absolutely necessary. So natural selection made the brain big for direct adaptive utility. I don't know what those features are. Fossil record doesn't work to preserve such things. We can speculate about them. The most conventional possible view, the brain got big by natural selection for things that are essential to our humanity. Does that mean that everything or most things, or even the most important things, that we now do with our brain and that we see as universal attributes that define our humanity, does it mean that those are the reasons why the brain got larger? Of course not. Of course it doesn't. The brain got big, probably for a relatively small subset of reasons mediated by natural selection. And then by virtue of the unprecedented computing power in the structure, was able to do a vastly increased number of things simply as side consequences of the computing power. Surely, when you get to something as complex as a brain on the computer analogy, the spandrels must, at least in number, overwhelm the reasons under natural selection. The brain gets big by natural selection for its subset of adaptive purposes, and then by virtue of its computing power is capable of doing all sorts of things that are totally quirky with respect to the reasons. They're just the side consequences of the reasons. Clearly the brain didn't get big so we could write or read. That's not what we did with it, yet we, in our intellectual elitism and parochiality, tend to think of those things as important. It's an enormously important principle, and to illustrate it, let me tell you about the most famous debate that Darwin and Wallace got into in the course of their lifetimes, because it was precisely about this issue. And Darwin's own insight, since Darwin was not a strict Darwinian, you see, that's the irony, the strict Darwinian was Wallace, but the strict adaptationist was Wallace. It is widely known that Wallace argued for the production of essentially everything by natural selection, but made one outstanding exception for the human brain. Now, usually that is interpreted as Wallace's failure of nerve relative to Darwin's consistency, because Darwin tried to explain all of nature through his evolutionary principles. And people say, well, Wallace just wasn't willing to go far enough. When push came to shove and he got to the human brain, that had to be created. He wasn't willing to do it. That may be right psychologically. I can't probe Wallace's psyche. That may be so. But there is a logic of Wallace's argument, as he presents it, showing conclusively that, in fact, Wallace's peculiar position with respect to natural selection not being able to produce the brain, and the brain necessarily being created, the only thing in all of nature so made, arises directly from Wallace's hyper-adaptationist viewpoint and his failure to appreciate the principle of spandrels. Argument goes like this. This is how Wallace presents it. Wallace, I keep mixing the two of them up. Wallace, very admirable man by 20th century standards. I'm not sure that's the appropriate way to analyze him. He was one of the very few genuinely non-racist scientists in the 19th century. Wallace really did believe that the brains of all peoples were essentially equal. However, he was a cultural chauvinist. He did not doubt for a moment that so-called advanced European society illustrated brain use orders of magnitude superior to what he called savage culture. And that put him in a dilemma because he was a strict hyper-adaptationist. Wallace really believed that every bump on every bone, every color band on every snail was built directly by natural selection for utility, and that's the only thing that happened. He really was very strict about it. And this put him in a dilemma. If the brains of all people are equal, but savage people representing primitives have cultures an order of magnitude more simple than those of advanced Europeans with the same brains, then how can the brain have been built by natural selection? Because natural selection only builds things for utility. But here you have primitive humanity having a brain as good as the Europeans and not using it. Can't happen. Selection only builds for use. And therefore, the brain must have been developed by some other principle. Now, Darwin was horrified by this argument. He writes Wallace a famous letter. He says, I hope you have not too completely murdered your child and my own, meaning natural selection, and then proceeds to give, if I may paraphrase, two basic critiques. The first is not concerned this argument, but I'll mention that he says it, namely that this so-called savage society that you talk about, Wallace, is a lot more complicated than you think. But the second argument that he gives is the spandrels principle. He says, this is absurd. How can you say that? Once you evolve a structure doesn't mean that at its first appearance you exhaust all potential usages. You build it for a reason, but it can do other things. If I can be anachronistic, since I'm still talking about Darwin, you put a computer in your factory, there's only one reason why you put it. There's that damn phone again. Sorry, I'm so distractible. It is my major fault as a lecturer. I remain convinced that it could be disconnected, but I give up. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Right. You put this computer in your factory, and the only reason you put it there is to issue paychecks and keep the accounts. That's all you need it for. But you can't help it. I mean, you can't just put it there, having the capacity to issue paychecks and keep the accounts, and not have it capable of doing lots more things. Now, surely you understand that with computers, the number of rather interesting things that the computer could do as quirky side consequences of the real reason you put it in the factory are obviously much greater, much richer, much more consequential potentially than the reasons themselves, which are only these little things of keeping the accounts and making the paychecks. Now, the brain must be like that. That is, it's built big by natural selection for a set of reasons, maybe pretty complex reasons, but surely by virtue of the computing power, it is capable of doing all sorts of things, orders of magnitude more things that are its spandrels, its side consequences of its construction at that size. Now, I like to say, and it sounds flip, but I don't think it is flip because there's analysis that goes behind it. This argument is the one-line refutation of human sociobiology. It really is, because human sociobiology is a theory based on the strict Darwinian principle of utility. To make it work, you've got to break the human behavioral repertoire into a series of items called traits. You then have to explain those traits as constructed by natural selection for their utility and enhancing Darwinian fitness, that is, individual reproductive success. But if most distinctive universal traits of human mentality are spandrels, you can't even run a sociobiological explanation for it. It doesn't apply. They weren't built as adaptations. They're side consequences. They're there. That's all there is to it. If I can give one particular example that comes from Freud, who's no intellectual hero of mine, but I think this is a good argument. Take a phenomenon like religion, or at least take the distinctive feature of belief in some higher power that seems to be so common, at least to most religions, that we often think of as universal. If you look at sociobiological speculation on the nature of religion, it's generally in the adaptive mode, and the most common argument, without being too caricatured about it, is to claim that religion has enormous and necessary value in tribal cohesion, that it has to do with social cohesion of groups. Freud had a different argument, at least for the general belief in higher supernatural continuing power. Freud said, and I think it was an interesting insight, that the most frightening fact, forget geology's frightening fact, yes, this one's worse, that the most frightening fact that our large brain ever allowed us to learn is personal mortality. And we can't help it. We have to become aware of it. We know we're going to die. Probably other animals don't appreciate that. They don't seem to have psychic distress over it, so far as we can tell. Now, you cannot argue that the brain became large. I guess you could, but I don't think anybody want to. It's hard to argue that the brain got large so that we would become aware of personal mortality. You just can't do it. It's one of those things you can't help but know after the brain gets large for other reasons. But knowing it, it's terrifying. There's nothing that could be more terrifying. And Freud argues, I think he's probably right, that the various forms of reincarnation theory, supernatural existence theory, and all that panoply of the world's religions is the desperate response of our learning about personal mortality. It's the way we deal with this frightening possibility of our personal and absolute disappearance. That's a spandrel. And if that's at the basis of the universality of religion, it's a spandrel. It's not an adaptation. All right, that's part one. Part two is about a very different theme, and it's shorter than part one. Not much. And it goes back to the most important evolutionary theme of ladders and bushes. You know, as a result of writing these popular columns for so many years, I become something of a bellwether. I like to think that I have a better understanding of the relative frequency of popular misconceptions about evolution than anyone else, because I just get so many letters, honorable letters, from people who are confused. And if you ask me what the standard misconceptions are, there are a whole bunch of them. I think there are three primary ones. One is a misconception about adaptation, exemplified by the letters you get that say, "What are male nipples for?" They're spandrels also, by the way. The other is what I call vernacular Lamarckism, and the letter that goes with that says, "Why do cave fishes not have eyes? It must be disuse." But by far the most common misconception has to do with the rendering. There's that phone. I knew there was a way to get rid of it. Thanks. By far the most common misconception has to do with rendering of evolution as a line, as a story of transformation rather than as a tale of splitting and speciation. It's the ladder versus the bush, as we were talking about. Yes, evolution is a bush, not a ladder. And the most beautiful misconception arising from that is the line either delivered pugnaciously from creationists who think they've really got the ultimate stumper of an argument, or from people who are genuinely and honorably confused about it, namely, you say people evolved from apes, right? And I say, yeah. You know, you call the common ancestor an ape, sure. He says, okay, I got you now. If humans evolved from apes, why are apes still around? That really, it's a wonderful argument because it's such precious nonsense once you realize that evolution is a bush and not a ladder. Yeah, I mean, humans evolved from apes. They split off from apes. I mean, yes, if apes had a bodily turn into humans in order for apes to give rise to humans, then I guess apes wouldn't be around. But since evolution is a branching bush, one line branches off and the others are still around. It's just not a problem. You know? And yet, I mean, I'm sorry, I know this is an obvious point. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I think there are important biases built into our way of conceptualizing evolution as linear transformation, even though we know, of course, that it's bush-like. What I'm getting at is I want you to see that when you talk about human essences, it's not the transformation of ape to Australopithecine to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. That isn't the story of human evolution. The story of human evolution, when you're talking about the essence of our species, Homo sapiens, is when that little population that gave rise to us, Homo sapiens, split off from the ancestral form Homo erectus. Where and when is a little population. It became all of us, because that's the beginning of our biological individuality, the individuality of our species, Homo sapiens. It's not some unilinear ladder extending deep down into a primate past, although there are those connections to be sure. Now, we had this seminar at lunchtime, and the issue came up, and I warned the 20 or so people who were there they'd have to endure 5 minutes of repetition, and here it comes. I just want to give one illustration. I think the next two slides show it as well, of the kinds of mistakes we make when we don't properly think of evolution as branching sequences and think of them as transformation sequences. I call it life's little joke, and it's a kind of precious irony, which goes like this, namely that it is virtually necessary, perverse and pernicious though it be, that given our tendency to depict evolution as transformation sequences, that our classic textbook illustrations must be illustrations of outstandingly unsuccessful lineages. Has to be so. These standard illustrations of evolution must be the story of unsuccessful lineages in the following way. Now, everybody knows what the standard textbook illustration of evolution is. It's horses, right? And I'll show you a couple of the standard pictures. It's the next slide. This is the oldest one. This is the famous chart that O.C. Marsh hastily drew for Thomas Henry Huxley in 1876. And you see the story of horses as a unilinear sequence of transformation. You see the reduction in number of toes, the increase in height of the teeth. The one trend you don't see here is the increase in body size, because Marsh chose to draw them all at the same scale. Here is the more famous illustration of W.D. Matthew in the pamphlet that the American Museum shop sold for 50 years, the translation of little Eohippus up the stratigraphic column as a linear sequence into modern horses, the reduction in number of toes, the increase in height of the teeth. And yet you cannot tell the story this way except or unless the lineage is outstandingly unsuccessful. Now, that sounds paradoxical. Well, why am I making such an absurd claim? The answer is that evolution is really a branching bush. If you insist on depicting it as a transformation series, then you are forced into this peculiar situation of using as your typical examples lineages that are so unsuccessful that the previously rich branching bush has been reduced to a single surviving twig, which in your ignorance you misinterpret as the acme an essence of a revolutionary drive moving in that direction from the start. That's certainly true of horses. Horses are an outstandingly unsuccessful lineage. There is but one surviving twig, the genus Equus, with its 8 species, including true horses, zebras, and asses. In the geological past, the horses were an enormously diverse group, with as many as 15 and 20 simultaneously living genera. at various times in the past. The reason why you think there's this unilinear sequence of increasing size is that another genus named Nenippus, which is no bigger than Eohippus, died out only 11,000 years ago, so it's not around anymore, to let you see that there was diversity and not all lineages moved to increasing size. What's more, the entire lineage of which the horse is a member is an outstandingly unsuccessful one. The perissodactyls, the the odd-toed ungulates, which today consist only of horses, rhinos, and tapirs, a pitiful remnant of a once greater diversity that included titanotheres, nuintotheres, and calicotheres, and rhinoceroses that swam and ran, and all sorts of creatures. Horse bush as it is today is a pitiful remnant of a pitiful remnant of a larger group. The success story are not the perissodactyls, it's the even-toed ungulates, the artiodactyls, the cattle, the bison, the deer, the sheep, the goats, the pigs, the camels, the giraffes, that great group. These are the ones that have taken over. The real success stories of evolution you never hear about. I mean, who has ever opened a textbook and read about the evolution of antelopes or bats or rodents? These are the success stories of a man, but there is no story as long as we insist on telling it as linear transformation sequence, because there are hundreds of antelopes, bats, and rodents testifying to the enormous success of those lineages. No, you only get classic textbook cases of outstandingly unsuccessful lineages when you insist on taking the true iconography of the bush and rendering it as linear transformation series. I need hardly remind you as a tangential comment, we can have the lights again, that there's at least one other mammalian lineage often depicted as a linear transformation, also holding the property of being but one surviving species of a once somewhat more luxurious bush, although in some respects a pretty darn successful species. Now, I think it's important that we contrast, that's why I went into this notion of linear transformation series with sequences of branching and speciation, because there are two ways of looking at human evolution, each corresponding to one of these, and I think the one that corresponds to the Bush model is not only correct in general, but empirically best supported at the moment. And we need to talk about this because the point I want to make about contingency will only work if you get rid of that notion of the linear transformation series and seriously ascertain and take cognizance of the model of branching, because I like to call these tendency and entity theories. I mean, the tendency theory of human evolution holds that you go way back into the history of primates, and there is a kind of predictable drive under natural selection towards the incarnation of greater mentality and self-consciousness in human beings eventually, that there is a lineage, it goes way back. It is moving probably on a worldwide basis because of the clear adaptive benefits under natural selection, particularly under the metaphor of the wedge, for cognition. You've got it. And a lot of the panoply of concepts in human evolution comes out of what I call tendency theory, the notion of a missing link, which really, of course, we don't hear that phrase much anymore, but it makes no sense. In the light of Bush theory, what could be a missing link? There are just lots of branch points, but of course if you have a linear transformation series, there may be that fundamental creature that would tie everything together. The single species hypothesis, which was popular in this country until empirically disproven some 5 to 10 years ago, there was a panoply of ecological concepts supporting it. That was the notion that the ecological range of hominid species is so broad that almost in principle you could never have inhabiting the same broad area more than any one species at any one time, and that therefore the story of human evolution would necessarily be a tale of the successive replacement of one by another, so that you go, according to the single species hypothesis, from the Australopithecines to the early Homo species to Neanderthal, which in that theory is the direct ancestor to modern human beings. That simply is not right. We know that in Africa, at least you have the coexistence of things so different as Homo erectus and robust Australopithecines, but undoubtedly at other times there's more than one as well. But the single species hypothesis, I think, is the last serious attempt to give a rationale for that notion. And Loring Brace, its main defender, in fact, used to contemptuously refer to notions of migration and contact between taxa as hominid catastrophism, a recreation of the worst form of Cuvier's old catastrophe theory from those who were not willing to accept that fundamental evolutionary truth of transformation. Now, in contrast, and probably the strongest version in its purest form is Carlton Kuhn's theory from The Origin of Races, a book that got a lot of notoriety in the 1960s, arguing that Homo sapiens evolved in each of its 5 major racial groups by his classification 5 separate times from 5 different stocks of Homo erectus, with some gene flow between them. I mean, absolute independence, but that you really have this candelabra model, as it's sometimes called, where you get as many lineages of Homo erectus as there are Homo sapiens today, and each one, given the predictable benefits of mentality, moving fundamentally the same direction, becoming the 5 major groups of Homo sapiens in Kuhn's theory. Now, in contrast to that, and I think abundantly supported empirically today, is what I like to call the entity theory. Namely, that Homo sapiens, modern humans, are an entity. The species is an entity, not a tendency. It's not the end result of a predictable set of evolutionary transformations based on known Darwinian utility. But like most evolutionary stories, there is a time and a place. And we have to ask when and where, of course. That's what I want to get to. That's important, because the when and the where could be answered in such a way that would make my argument about contingency irrelevant. So it does depend empirically on the answer to the when and the where, but you first have to have the framework to even ask that when and where, which allows contingency to enter the story. Under the entity theory, you have to ask about Homo sapiens. You don't see Homo sapiens as the end predictable result of this long series of linear transformations, but Homo sapiens becomes, like most species, an entity. It's a higher level individual. It's a thing. It arises somewhere by splitting as a discrete population from its ancestral taxon Homo erectus, which presumably then goes on and eventually becomes extinct, and then spreads out, of course, eventually to make the worldwide population of Homo sapiens with its various racial divisions. But there is a point of origin. There is an entity. Now, is this relevant to this question of essence, defined as distinctive universals given to us by biology? Because, you see, you could argue, and indeed most people have argued until the last few years, that, oh, sure, I mean, there is a common point somewhere for all Homo sapiens. In Kuhn's theory, it's way back before Homo erectus. But you know, that common point is so far ago. It's so far back in the mists of history, and so much, so complex, has happened since then, that if there are any universal distinctive features remaining in us, they cannot be simple contingent remembrances, if you will, of the happenstances of what the ancestral population was like, because all that's erased long ago. It was too far ago. There's been too much shaping and molding and building by the honing of the wedge in Darwinian natural selection since then, so that there really are distinctive universals. They're best explained under the tendency theory. That is, they are bits made by natural selection in order to allow human beings to become what we are today. So history is overwhelmed. Contingency doesn't matter. And that's been the standard view. Isn't history overwhelmed by virtue of the depth of human origins? And until the last 2 years, the answer to that would have been yes, as given by most people in the profession. Now, for many years, some of the most exciting material in the study of human evolution, some of the work Tim White did on the Australopithecus afarensis, our oldest ancestors from the AFAR, had to do with material at the early end of human history, and that work goes on. Tim tells me he's back in Ethiopia now, and we'll continue to get more wonderful information from the early stages, but that's not what I want to talk about. What's happened in the last couple of years is we've had a virtual flood of new information from many sources at the other end, at the very recent end, at what's happened not deep down as far back as we can get towards the point of our ancestry with apes, but at the other end, at the timing and point of the origin of the species Homo sapiens itself, our entity, our biological individual. And these conclusions involve fundamentally two subjects, topology and timing. That is the shape of the evolutionary tree of human groups and when all the splittings occurred. And the empirical conclusions about topology and timing that have been developed just in the last year or two are astoundingly supportive of the view that contingency is much more important than we ever would have dreamed. The evidence is largely genetic. It's buttressed by paleontology, which is consistent with the genetic story, but also buttressed by studies of archaeology, by studies of human languages, and much of this work is actually being done here, so I'm pleased to report about it in this forum. Now, if you ask where the entity Homo sapiens starts, the answer almost surely seems to be Africa at this point. Darwin himself correctly identified Africa as the ultimate home of human ancestry, and I think, though that was refuted for a long time for various reasons, rooted as much in racism and Aryan origin myths as in empirics, that's not been in dispute for a while. But what has been in dispute, even though everybody admits that Africa is surely the home of our split from the ape lineage, well, surely, probably, is under the entity theory where the species Homo sapiens arises, because that's not so clear, you see. Because we know that the immediate ancestral species, Homo erectus, was present throughout the old world. There's African erectus, European erectus, and of course there's East Asian erectus. That's the Java man and Peking man of the old classifications that expressed all these people as though they're only half of us, but there they are. So Homo erectus is all over the old world, and therefore Homo sapiens in principle could have arisen on any of those continents. But the latest evidence seems to indicate that not only did the whole human lineage begin in Africa, but that each successive species probably has an ultimate African origin. The Australopithecine species are all African. The oldest Homo erectus is African, even though it then moved out. And it looks as though, from the genetic and paleontological evidence, that Homo sapiens also emerged from an African stock of Homo erectus, which means, of course, that the East Asian Homo erectuses have nothing to do with our ancestry, that they just died out, which means probably that the famous Neanderthal is not a brutish caveman ancestor, but is also a European form and collateral species, which, despite its undoubted conceptual and cognitive complexity, probably also had nothing to do with us. Now, many of you, and I'm not going to, especially at this late hour, go in great depth to the arguments, because it's been on the cover of Newsweek, who broke conceptual ground by showing our ancestors as minimally black. They weren't very black, but they were black, to honor, even though we, of course, don't know the colors, to honor the African continent. But I think the most important new line of evidence comes from the genetic information. There have been several studies. They differ in minor details, but there is a great confluence between them. The two that have gotten the most publicity are the studies on mitochondrial DNA done by Alan Wilson and his colleagues at Berkeley, and the recent article summarizing everything we know about the more standard nuclear genetic allozyme information that was published by Luca Cavalli-Sforza of this university in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences just 3 or 4 months ago. I think the mitochondrial work has been more reported, so let me just very briefly summarize, without giving a long story of how they got to it, the conclusions of the mitochondrial study. This is based on sequencing 10% of the DNA of the mitochondria. That's a lot of evidence, 1,600 base pairs. The basic technique is simplicity itself. Applying it is enormously labor-intensive. Namely, obviously, when two people share a common ancestor, I mean, at the point of common ancestry, they have the same genome, they have the same genes, and therefore, in principle, the more unlike any two people are, in their genetic sequences, the longer ago did they have a common ancestor. Because they've only been separate for 5 generations, there's not enough time for much genetic divergence. They've been separate for a long time. That's time for more genetic divergence. Now, I know it is not a one-to-one correlation. The clock of DNA doesn't tick with enormous regularity, but as a rough correlation, it ought to work pretty well. There should be a reasonably good correlation between extent of genetic distance and time since common ancestry. So in principle, you can take the mitochondrial DNA or whatever you're using from large numbers of people representing as many different groups as you can get, make a matrix showing the average genetic distance between any two, and then make an evolutionary tree on the principle that the greater the genetic distances, the longer ago did these two share common ancestry. When you do that with the 147 human beings that Wilson and his group used, trying to get as full a range of racial diversity as they could, the tree has an astoundingly simple topology. I mean, much simpler than I would have thought. The mitochondrial tree essentially gives 2 branches. One branch has only African people on it. The other branch has other African people plus everybody else. That's remarkably simple sort of topology, which I think very strongly points to Africa as the ancestral home of the species Homo sapiens. The only common factor to both those branches are African people, and there's more diversity among African people than there is among all the rest of the world put together. So I think all of that indicates an African home. Now that, however, will not carry my argument. It's a nice, simple topology indicative of entity theory and of an African home, but it doesn't carry the argument for contingency for a very simple reason. Namely, you could quite correctly say to me, yes, but maybe that was 10 million years ago. All right, I mean, I know there's a common ancestry somewhere, but I got to know when, because if it's ancient, then there's been adequate time for the erasure of any happenstance of history that's common to all people at their origin, and therefore any universal would simply have to be the evolved, predictable features of human perfection, of human complexity. So the argument on timing is essential. And if you're willing to accept, and I cannot justify this, that mitochondrial DNA is ticking along at a relatively constant rate in its changes, the best justification you can give is that when you can calibrate, at least in mammalian studies, rates of change of mitochondrial DNA from independent evidence of branching points known from the fossil record or from biogeography, that the assumption of constancy of rate broadly holds. But it could be wrong. These dates are not perfect by any means and not irrefutable. But when you apply that assumption to that simple topology of the mitochondrial tree, the answer is that all non-African racial diversity, that is all the diversity on that branch, that second branch, is 80 to 140,000 years old, I think it was. And the two branches joined somewhere between 180 and 240,000 years ago in Africa. In other words, now to summarize all of this in a single and simple sentence, that may sound like a lot of time to you non-geologists, but to us it's nothing. I mean, if Homo sapiens emerged within the last couple 100,000 years in Africa, there has been so little time for the development of racial diversification throughout the world relative to what we used to think was the probable time scale, that it becomes quite plausible that some of the universal distinctive features of human beings might be historical retentions from this recent common ancestry and not deep eminences, not deep essences of the soul in that different sense. What's more, and this is what Cavalli-Sforza showed in his study, first of all, Cavalli-Sforza got a tree that's differences in detail, but it's very close to the Wilson et al. Tree of the mitochondrial DNA, and Cavalli-Sforza was using the standard genetic data on ordinary allozymic differences. But what Cavalli did was to go further and to try and correlate with the genetic tree that corroborates the mitochondrial tree the data on human languages and archaeological results. And you know, language really shouldn't correlate very well with the genetic tree because language is so subject to non-evolutionary and other forms of mixing up and changing around. I mean, look at any one of us. Look at me. Look at you. I'm standing here in America speaking English, but my ancestors, as Disraeli said, were priests in the Temple of Solomon when whoever invented English was what did he say? I don't know, some savage in an English forest or something. You know, we mix and match our languages. It shouldn't work, and yet there really is an astonishing correlation between languages spoken and the genetic tree. I mean, for example, the Caucasian peoples all speak, with some odd exceptions like Basque, which nobody understands. Except Basque people. Nobody understands origin. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. If there are any Basque speakers here, I really didn't mean it in that sense. I mean, its origin is unknown. That all Caucasian peoples speak two very closely related linguistic families, either the Indo-European family or the Semitic family, the Arabic Hebrew family. And then, of course, there are these rather interesting theories that linguistic scholars have tended to scoff at, but which I think are made eminently plausible and worthy of consideration by recent information on the extreme recency of depth of human ancestry. First, the Nostratic theory, so-called, which tries to tie the Indo-European group with another group, the Altaic languages of northern Asia. If you look at the genetic tree, those are the two most closely linked groups, and then there's Professor Greenberg here who's trying to link some of the American Indian languages in with that great group. And if you again consult Cavalli-Sforza's genetic tree, they are the next group that enter the branching order. So there do seem to be correlations between the linguistic trees as we understand them, very strong correlation. Of course there are exceptions. There are bound to be exceptions. The Ethiopian people who are African by genetics speak a language that's close to the Arabic Hebrew family, but we know the reason for that exception. It's a point of contact that's lasted for several thousand years. So I think I would say that whatever these distinctive human universals are, they're not the essence of our created perfection. They're not the precious distillate of the wedge. They're not the cause and the matrix of our power in evolutionary terms. If there are universals, say, in human languages, and I think it's not impossible that there may be, it's just what some folks in Africa happened to be saying to each other when we all originated so little time ago. The Tower of Babel may emerge as a strikingly accurate metaphor. We probably did once speak the same language, and we did diversify into incomprehension as we spread over the face of the earth. But the original tongue was not an optimal construction given by miracle to all people. Our original linguistic unity is only historical happenstance. It's not created perfection. We were once a small group of Africans, and the mother tongue is whatever those folks said to each other. It's not the Holy Grail. It's just the contingency of what they said. But I also sense a deeper importance in this remarkable correlation among all major criteria for reconstructing our family tree. And I think this high correspondence can only mean that a great deal of human diversity, far more than we ever dared hope, achieves a remarkably simple explanation in history itself. If you know when a group split off and where it spread, you have the basic outline in most cases of its relationship with other groups. The primary signature of time and history is not effaced, or even strongly overlain in most cases, by immediate adaptation to prevailing circumstances, or by recent episodes of conquest and amalgamation. We remain the children of our past, and we might even be able to pool our differences and to extract some inferred pathways, to extract from inferred pathways of change, a blurred portrait of our ultimate parent. But again, I remind you that ultimate parent is only the historical happenstance of who we were in Africa then. So in conclusion, there's a little epilogue. Yes, there are essences, probably, given to us by biology, defined as these distinctive universals, but rather than being those Darwinian agencies of our mount up the ladder of life under the metaphor of the wedge, they're much more likely to be A, side consequences under the principle of spandrels, and B, historical contingencies. That is not the predictable necessary excellences, but just what the African ancestors so little ago happened to be. And why not? Quirks and uniquenesses are just as deep and just as meaningful as the majesty of Newtonian regularity, or the sharpness of Darwin's perfecting wedge. I think they're just as interesting. I said they're even twice as interesting. I believe that. There's a little epilogue I have to give you, particularly some here at Stanford. I'd just like to speculate a little bit on why is it that we're attracted so much anyway to the idea of essences. Why is this a question at all? Why throughout our history have we been hung up on this search for distinctive, deep universals that are somehow more meaningful than superficial behaviors? I don't know. Of course I don't know. Does it arise out of the abstract logic of thought? Is it the only way we can categorize things? I think many people assume so. But I'd like to argue that it's least plausible that this strong desire we've had for essences is in itself, look, it may just be an oddity of Western culture, of some cultures, I don't know, but it's at least plausible to argue that this desire to map essences is in itself a quirk and contingency of how the mind was built historically. I think this position can be defended. I think it is the proper evolutionary reading of the work that Professor Tversky has done here for so long on what he, I forget exactly what he calls it, but I like to think of it as cognitive styles that don't necessarily match the logic of thought. We're terrible probability calculators. Now that may be just the culture we live in, but Tversky at least and others and Kahneman think that it's deeper than that, and it represents ways in which we are built to think. And I think we're terrible probability calculators, and yet there's so much of the world that involves probability. I'll show you my last slide, which is a comment on that. I'll tell you one Tversky story, and then you're out of here. But, oh, I forgot about all my punctuated equilibrium slides. Too bad. It's my favorite subject. I completely forgot. I was going to give you the punctuated equilibrium argument, which is a substantiation of the importance of entity theories. Too bad. That's to show you from, I choose that for you, Tim, because it's pigs, which Tim studies when he isn't studying people. We're pretty close, after all. That punctuated equilibrium works pretty well, and it's a good model. I forget what that is. Okay, this is one of Roz Chast's wonderful cartoons. And it's a beautiful commentary on how lousy we are at probability calculators. One of the reasons we're such bad probability calculators is we think there's essential truth and coincidence because we never calculate the non-coincidences. We just don't do it. And that's, of course, the world's most nothing coincidences. As Tina was washing the dishes, the phone rang. Bob was wearing a striped tie, whereas Lucille was sporting her new hat. Just as little Tony was thinking about pizza, Nan decided to vacuum. But of course that's right. Don't you see she's right? Each one of those is just as coincidental as the ones we think that are meaningful. But these don't catch our fancy, so we don't calculate off them. And we never get the right calculation of what it means. Let me have the lights. And Tversky and Kahneman and others and their group have done studies on this for years. I'll just tell you one story. It happens to be one that intrigued me. I know there are all interpretations, but it does, at least their interpretation of this does make plausible the notion that maybe we're actually built as essence-seeking thinkers rather than as probability calculators, which we ought to be. In one of their famous experiments, they constructed hypothetical characters and wrote little paragraphs describing them. And then you get a bunch of people, and it doesn't matter whether you pull people off the street corner or get mathematics graduate students, they still make the same mistakes. You construct a hypothetical profile of, one of them involves a woman named Linda, and they give a description of Linda. And she's described as a very socially conscious, left to liberal woman who's been active in the feminist movement and a whole variety of left to liberal social causes. And that description is clear. And you then get a set of attributes about Linda, which you're supposed to rank in order of least probable to most probable. And several of them are blind. There are only three that really constitute the test. The three that count are the following propositions. Linda is a bank teller. Linda is active in the feminist movement. And Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. And again, as I said, it doesn't matter whether you pull people off the street corner or out of the mathematics lounge. People invariably, as a statistical sample, will rank as more probable than the statement Linda is a bank teller. The statement Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. And, you know, that can't be, folks. It just cannot be. No conjunction in the world can be more probable than one of its elements. It can't be. And now if you ask why it is that people say, why do people think it's more probable that she's both a bank teller and active in the feminist movement than she's just a bank teller? Which cannot be right. I mean, if you really operate in your life off that assumption, you're going to make some terrible mistakes, because it's got to be more probable she's just a bank teller, right? I mean, when it's pointed out to you, it's clear to everybody. And I was, oh God, of course that's right. Now, there are several interpretations of what it means. I've heard one linguistic interpretation, and it's a simple one, and maybe it's right in this case, which is that it isn't what Tversky and Kahneman think it is. It's just that it's a quirk of language, namely when we see the statement, Linda is a bank teller, we interpolate into it, and is not active in the feminist movement, even though it's not written there. And if we do that, then the statement, she's a bank teller and active, is more probable than she's a bank teller and not active, given the description. Maybe that's right, I don't know. But Tversky and Kahneman have done so many of these experiments, all leading in the same direction. I tend to accept their interpretation of these kinds of stories, namely, as they argue that we're just not constructed as probability calculators. We can learn to think that way. Of course we can. I mean, I'm not talking about unbeatable intrinsic programming. I'm not talking biological determinism. I'm talking about how we're built to think. We can train ourselves to do otherwise, and that happens to be correct. But we're poor at probabilities. That's why we're poor after Las Vegas. And Tversky's interpretation is that we're just not operating as probability calculators, even though that's right. We're doing something else. We're matching to type. That's what we do. It works most of the time. We match to type. We've been given a type of Linda. We have a picture. We abstract it. We make an essence out of it. We then have a bunch of statements, and we match those to the type of Linda. Now, that is a curious way to think about things, yet I think it is natural reasoning. That's the phrase they use. I think it may be expressive of a form of natural reasoning that we do construct notions of type or essence and then match the particular statements to it. Now, I don't know, that may just be a peculiarity of this particular culture, but it could be the way we're designed to think preferentially, and it would lead us, wouldn't it, to a search for essences and to the preciousness of it. It's also a style that works most of the times, but is outstandingly wrong, often in a world of probabilities. So I finally really do end this talk with a sort of precious irony, namely that the only reason we even ask the question about essences, because we have evolved mental properties that debunk older ideas of the essences, namely the side consequences and the historical contingencies, force us to think in terms of those essences. That would be interesting if that were so. And I'll end there. Thank you. Long. Oh yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, I'll 15 minutes. I'll stop at maximum. Yeah. Questions, comments, arguments? Anybody wants to leave? Of course, please do. Better if you stay. Yeah. I can't hear a word you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, but that's really not how standard Darwinian argument works. Of course that's plausible. I mean, what you're doing is giving a very good summary of the argument I presented, to get something as complicated as some of these spandrels just arising for no reason in Darwin's world, there's no way they can be built, there's no way they can hang around until they're co-opted for utility in the standard view. And in fact, I think the standard terminology of the Darwinian apparatus supports what I say, because there is no word in the standard armamentum of evolutionary language for features that arise as side consequences for no reason related to adaptation and are then later seized for some form of utility. There is a term pre-adaptation, but that's only for the Nairobi recycling principle. That you can build something for one reason, which is fortuitously pre-adapted as it were for something else. But that only talks about quirky functional shift, things built for one reason that are then fortuitously suited for other functions. In fact, when I first worked on this with Elizabeth Verba, we had to construct a word, exaptations, we called such structures that emerged as spandrels for no utility were later co-opted, because there was no term. No, it's not there. You're perfectly right. Of course it's right that natural selection can seize anything for utility. But the notion that things as complex as these spandrels can arise in the context of no adaptation is certainly not part of the general framework of natural selection theory. If it was, there'd be terms. We don't even have them. Yeah, I'll maybe get to you, but I'm right there at the moment. Yeah. Yeah, I can't hear you. Maybe we'll wait till... Yep. I'm sorry. I mean, your criticism is right. Let me just say something. I really wanted to fudge that issue. It doesn't matter for the argument. There is obviously some broad correlation between size and our capacity, in the sense that our Australopithecine ancestors with 1/3 our cranial capacity weren't doing what we did. No, that correlation is roughly there. I mean, I just talked about that because that's the simplest, crudest way. I don't for a minute believe that's all there is to cognitive capacity. It doesn't affect the argument. Yeah. But your criticism is correct. I accept it, of course. Yeah. But go ahead. Yeah. So. What else? What does it matter what you use? I mean, I could have said, you know, I gave my line. I said, I'll take the most conventional view. The brain got big by ordinary natural selection. But I could say it another way. I'll say, I'll take the most conventional view. Whatever it is that gave us our cognitive powers arose by natural selection. Same argument still applies. The spandrels are there by virtue of the power of the brain, whatever constitutes it. It doesn't have to be the... all right, I'm sorry if I gave the impression that the argument is linked to the crudity of size. It's the easiest way to deal with it, and I think the correlation is there, and it's real. But, yeah. That's a little more defensible, but you realize that's not what you're doing with horses. This is also, it's interesting you raise that, because that's the issue, precisely the issue that came up at this lunchtime seminar. If you're just interested, as I put it then, in Man of War, then that's fair enough. Man of War was a terrific horse, and he has a set of ancestors, and they do go back to Eohippus. But that's not what the textbook case of the evolution of the horse is about. You're quite right, and that's what we do with human family trees, Martin pointed out at the seminar. If you're interested in my ancestors, I can produce my family tree, but that's not the function that the evolution of the horse example is meant to show. It's meant to be a typical example of evolutionary sequences. And I'll say something else, that even though, of course, you're right, I mean, any particular ancestor has a... It's still not a linear sequence a la the march of Eohippus to Equus. What you have is this bush, right? The bush has lots of twigs. Any one twig has a pathway back to the stem, but it's not a line. It's some odd labyrinthine wandering, and at any point it goes off at a variety of... Yes, there is one peculiar pathway through the labyrinth of the bush that gets back, but I think even linearizing that is wrong. But I accept your point. If it is indeed the lineage of a particular item of interest, you may do that. Yeah. Yeah. No, because I think there is an empirics of human evolution. There's a real difference between Brace's single species hypothesis, which says only one at any one time, and full-scale transformation one to the next, and the depiction of the origin of Homo sapiens as a little population from the African stock of Erectus, while the European stock of Erectus and the Asian stock of Erectus die. That's empirically very different. And a statement about the timing of that splitting in Africa as being only 100 to 200,000 years ago, much less than people thought. That's an empirical statement. It's true that that population of Homo sapiens has an ancestor who has an ancestor, and you can linearize that, but there's a whole empirical set of conclusions involved in saying in one place very little time ago as an entity quickly arising by speciation from a stock of Erectus, and that's what I was talking about. Yeah. Go ahead. But say it loud. Yeah, but I think all the gentleman's saying and saying that they're linear is that at least every descendant has an ancestor, even though that ancestor, of course, may have gone off in a whole variety of directions. I think linear only in that sense of the term, not in the mathematical sense. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know how to test it. I don't even know how I could know whether it's so until we figure out ways to make, if you can, inferences from language, from tools or early artistic representations, and I don't know that we'll ever be able to do that. I don't even know that there's a canonical form of the argument. The canonical argument certainly is that language is somehow fundamental, but I don't know that most people argue that Homo sapiens had it and Homo erectus didn't. I don't know how we would know that. Also, I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence that sapiens did erectus in Asia. I think it's just as likely erectus was gone by the time any sapiens ever got there for whatever sets of reasons, but we don't know that. I wish we could get at that question. It's a very important one, but I just don't think the nature of historical evidence is very likely to give us much insight into that. Yeah. It depends on what you define it as. If you define sociobiology merely as the statement that it's legitimate to do evolutionary studies of behavior, you'd have to be against apple pie to confute it. And of course there's an evolutionary story. I mean, I told you evolutionary stories about behavior. They're all about spandrels and other things that sociobiology doesn't deal with. No, I think that, you see, I just think there's a basic fallacy in the... It doesn't mean they're never right about some things, but if you're dealing with a research program that has a deep fallacy at its core, then it's not likely to be. If 80% of what's important, I don't know how to put a number on it, but if my gut feeling is right, that most of the behaviors that our universal and sociobiology would like to talk about are spandrels and not traits evolved by natural selection, you can't run the argument. The most you could do is explain maybe why natural selection is maintaining them now, but that's not fundamentally the depth of the program as originally designed, which is explain why the behaviors are there, not just why they're maintained having arisen for other reasons. So I just don't think it's very promising. Yeah, in the back. Oh, no, I mean, I suppose that's an important question. I tend not to think, it's not that I'm not broad-minded, maybe I am, but that's such a large and important question that can't really, it sounds paradoxical, but I don't think it is, that can't be at the forefront of a scientist's attention when you're working on questions. I guess the most I could say would sound trite, though I believe it with all my heart, namely that a lot of the trouble this Earth is in has to do with human hubris at its core, and that hubris is supported by the biases, and the more we can do to make us recognize ourselves as one poor struggling species among many and not as the predestined crown of creation, probably going to be helpful with respect to our powers. But I'm not under the illusion that spandrels are going to save the world. But yeah.
You were saying that in the study of contingencies, the means in and of itself interesting. It seems that the efforts in sociobiology to understand where creativity comes from would be a good example of one of the ways that
You mean in the sense that you mean following my last point that it's almost inevitable that we'd want to try and explain it that way?
well, no, you're saying that the study of contingencies is very interesting, and so maybe sociobiology is one way, one application of that approach. One of the ways that the study of contingencies can be interesting is to help one understand.
Oh, but only in that broader sense of why we like sociobiological explanations, because sociobiology is so fundamentally not about contingencies. I mean, it's about those traits that this man is trying to shut me up. I can see it, and I bow to his mastery here. Bye.
Probably wrung as much wisdom as we can reasonably hope for tonight from our speaker. So thank you very much.
It was long, like yesterday.
Well,